The History Things podcast is brought to you by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Visit trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to receive 10% off your next purchase. Thanks for listening. Now let's start the show.
Are you ready?
Welcome back, everyone, to the History Things podcast. Just a reminder to check out our sponsor, TR Historical, and get 10% off at trhistorical.com.
Use our promo code HistoryThings. Get a discount, guys.
Save some money.
Save some money.
I'm your host, Matt Borders, and with me, as always, is my historical co-host and sidekick, Pat McGuire.
Sidekick, yes, I am the sidekick. What's up, Matt? Good to be back. Very excited. Rolling, through our second half of season 3 here. It's like a train with no brakes, brother.
That's right.
Woo!
And we are going to keep chugging along. In fact, we are bringing back our, or I should say, this is our follow-up episode for.
We're bringing them back.
Yeah, we are bringing them back.
We're bringing them back, big time.
But our follow-up episode for our third episode.
That's right. We're in our third season, or our third episode cycle. So we are in quarter 3. We are on the Western Front.
Yep.
We're still alive.
And
I know you guys were very,
Somme.
I know you guys were very concerned about that, but we're still alive. And joining us today is our good buddy, Rob Enfield from British Muzzleloaders. We're very excited to have him back. Rob, what's up, dude? Thank you so much for joining us again.
Well, hey, we had such a good time the first time around. I'm glad that you decided to have me back for the second.
We weren't so weird that we chased you away, were we?
No, not at all.
Good.
Excellent.
Good.
You were saying that you were wondering if you were too weird or something. You joined me. You pushed me away. I'm the guy that wears a kilt in the woods with no one around. So don't talk to me about weird people, please.
You are my hero, though.
You look sharp doing it, too. I've seen those videos.
Well, before we get into what we're going to talk about here today, we want to sort of slam the brakes on the story of the Somme, which I know can be very hard, especially for our listeners who've probably been grueling through the first episode we did with you. But we want to focus a little bit about your work, what you do over on British Muzzleloader. So can you tell all of the History Things podcast listeners where to find you and what it is that you do over there?
Right. So British Muzzleloaders is the name of the YouTube channel that I started in 2012, I think. I'm not exactly sure. I think it was 2012. Anyway, to cut a long story short, what it's all about is a genre of, what would you call it? Activity, research, something along those lines that I've termed and has been generally accepted as being historical shooting.
Okay.
And that's a way to describe the channel. So what that means in a nutshell is essentially the exploration of historical firearms, in my case, through a, wait for it, a primarily 19th and early 20th century military British and Empire firearms world. So it's a bit of a niche, understandably, but I'm a Canadian. And so it directly, our history, especially in those particular timeframes, is tied extensively and very closely to that of the British Empire writ large. So in studying these, it also has a direct correlation with, Canadian military history. So that's the foundation of the channel. And throughout its various episodes, I explore various aspects of typically service firearms, long arms, carbines, that kind of stuff, that are associated with British and Empire armies. This goes all the way back. I think the oldest one I've got, I know the oldest original firearm I own is a 1820 Brown Bess that is exemplary, although obviously made after Waterloo, is exemplary of the type that was used during the Napoleonic Wars. And I've carried sort of the spectrum, as it were, throughout the channel, all the way up to about the 1950s with the end of the Lee Enfield series of service rifles. Canada is a little bit fraught with some laws and technicalities that sort of prevent me from exploring in the way that I would like beyond that when we get into self-loading rifles and whatnot. And of course, older things just don't exist really. But smoothbore muzzle-loading flintlock muskets obviously existed much before the Napoleonic era. But that's sort of the sort of the left and right of arc, as it were, that I've chosen for the channel. It's sort of where my particular interest lies. And what I've tried to do with the channel is present these in a way that isn't just sort of sitting talking about them over a bench or something like that, but it's the actual use of them, the shooting of them, the drills, because it's got a military kind of history bent to it, the drills and associated training that goes along with all of these different types of firearms. And I sort of built the channel with that in mind, moving through it. It's deviated in some degrees with a bit more maybe heavy on the history side of things in certain aspects and presentations. And others are strictly, videos would be strictly shooting without a lot of history discussion. Although the obviously the subject material of that particular weapon is pertinent to the history. So anyway, it's sort of an ongoing project, as it were, and having great fun doing it. We have a wonderful bunch of supporters through Patreon. Primary viewing, of course, is done through YouTube, although I have branched out into a number of other avenues because of some, I'm sure those of us who are on YouTube have experienced it to some degree, a little bit of friction in regards to the subject material and what they allow and that kind of stuff. So anyway, plugging along, forging ahead. The channel, as of this recording, has recently passed 75,000 subscribers, which I have nobody to thank but the viewers and supporters. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. We're huge fans. We are among those 75,000. One of my favorite things that you do is the history stuff. Like I enjoyed particularly the episode where you were playing the Scottish soldiers in the snow, sitting with each other. Do you edit all those videos yourselves? Like, do you have somebody that does that work for you, or are you the entire machine behind
the channel is with some very, I would say probably 3 or 4 exceptions on literally 3 or 4 videos. It's essentially a one-man show.
Oh, fantastic. I'm a huge fan of it. Yeah. So I loved the one where you were sitting there talking to yourself.
You'll have to put some context to that. That sounds a bit
weird
when you say it that way. But yes, technically, yes, I am talking about it.
That's very cool. Our listeners know that history is full of weird and interesting, but fun and good. Never that bad kind of weird. Always that good kind of weird. So no, we're huge fans. And when we had in our private community of friends and colleagues, when a few people found out that we were having you on the show, because we're in the historical community, we have a lot of firearm aficionados, historians, things like that. And people were very excited that we were going to be talking to you. So we are equally excited to have you on. So Matt, pick things up. We kind of left things off at mostly the end of day 1 of the Somme campaign, the bloodiest, the worst, the most terrible day in British military history. We're going to kind of start there just to set some context, get the mojo back up. Tell our listeners a little bit about what we're doing today.
Sure. Rob, you did a great job really setting the stage for us, not even starting, say, in the days leading up to July 1. Rob, you took us all the way back to 1914 and really the destruction of the old contemptibles and the original or the professional British Army there, the BEF at the beginning of the war, and the development of the new army, Kitchener's army, and how that came about and how the Somme is going to be their first real taste of significant combat. You gave some really good examples of how this campaign comes about. We talked a lot about the importance of Verdun and how this is to help take some of the pressure off the French that are getting slammed, to be perfectly honest, at Verdun.
Yeah, they're in a fight. They're
in a serious fight. Exactly. And then, of course, we touched on beyond just the infantry. We looked at that heavy days-long bombardment that would precede the attacks on July 1st. And then, of course, we dove into July 1st itself. And you really started to break down some of the old tropes, if you will, regarding this attack. specifically that it wasn't lambs being led to slaughter.
Yes.
The lions led by donkeys idea. You did a great job really breaking down the kit. The fact that these guys couldn't necessarily go bolting across the landscape because they're carrying a bunch of stuff. Literally. And had a lot more stuff with them than the British Army did in 1914 at the beginning of the war. They were expected to go forward, dig in, and improve those shattered trench lines that they found. And to do that, they had to carry a lot of extra gear. So that was fantastic. But of course, getting into the fight itself, July 1st, 1916 would see, as you said, Pat, the worst day in British military history, 57,000 plus casualties and over 19,000 dead. Now, Rob, you were commenting that this is not all bad. There were some successes across the line, and I'd like to really pick it up there with some of the details. Of course, we did see some of the extreme ends with the destruction of the 1st Newfoundland, and you'd asked us to double check on the division that they were in. They were actually in the 29th Division, just as you thought they had been.
Nailed it.
Yep, you got it, my friend. But I thought we would start today with getting into some more of the specifics of day one with Thiepval, and then we'll let you take it from there and push beyond, because I think we focus so much on the first day's fighting and the terrible casualties that occur that most folks don't realize that this is a months-long campaign. Yeah. And I'd really like to see us get into some detail and depth on that.
Yeah, so we definitely want to get into a little bit of just some of the bullets on January or on July 1, but yeah, definitely the bigger story.
Mm-hmm. Interesting you mentioned that, because in our interval here, thinking about sort of the way to start things off, we're on the same page. So there's certainly a lot of sort of caveats maybe to mention about moving forward from the first, and the fact that you did mention it there. This is a campaign. Often we think of, like even the Western Front being a campaign, a collection of battles, and the Battle of the Somme is not just a singular action the first day, July 1st. As you mentioned, it's months long, and it's a series of hugely, costly sometimes, well, most of the time, I should say, but big efforts made at differing times in different parts of within the Somme sector. So to understand that the Battle of the Somme is not just the first day and then horrible casualties and everybody stopped, is that they picked up the next day and pushed on and tried to pick up the pieces of July 1st, rotate troops around and push again. And essentially, they didn't stop pushing till November. And that, I think, is a really important point to drive home, especially for those people that might be listening that aren't particularly familiar with the Somme, that just the name Battle of the Somme sounds like a battle. But this Battle of the Somme is, in fact, a collection of each independently large battle involving thousands and thousands of men each time. And in that sense, that the sort of the titanic nature of it, much like at Verdun as well, is that over this period of months, there's a huge number of units that are rotated through that particular part of the front in order to perpetuate the campaign, the fighting, the attempt to push on. And to put that in the right context, as you have done, is something that I wanted to make sure that was mentioned moving into our discussion today.
I got chills when you said they picked up on July 2nd. Like, that just gave me chills, because I think people think there's nothing left of the British. And just that the simple wordage you used right there when you said they picked up on July 2nd, I was like, wow, like while you were talking.
It's, when you look at the list of the actual number of, the number of battles that happen, you flip the page onto the next one, you flip the next page, you're onto the next one. And it goes on and on and on. And the campaign, the Battle of the Somme does evolve from its initial attempts and ideas. And they sort of as the time passes, they focus on certain areas of the greater battlefield, and they not neglect, but they don't emphasize, as far as fighting, other parts. So they sort of, I guess today they'd say they reinforce success. That needs to have a little bit of caveat put to it, especially when we talk about, I guess, the Great War battles in general, but also the Somme, that there are no hugely, significant breakthroughs happen. That's just not a feature of fighting up until 1918. So it all has to be in the right context. This is the nature of warfare in 1916. This is from both sides. And that's an important, piece to bring into it. Our discussions, as we've talked about before, and we will today, is some of these numbers are just mind-blowing. And it, especially with the social history that's come since the war and the various waves of reassessment, social impacts on the way those are viewed, that the lions by donkeys piece, the fact that it was a bunch of incompetents that were running this show. Every army does have strong individuals and weak ones, but I'm glad that in the modern context, that veil of aspect to the way the war is looked at is being, and it's not a malicious way, but it's being cut through. It's being examined again, and some of the biases that may have come out for other reasons are being put in their proper context so that we can focus on the realities of things. And it's a really exciting time since the centenary, as we talked about in the first part, that this regeneration of interest about the Great War and the number of really, really keen, sharp minds that are putting effort and time into a better contextualization of what was going on. And it's really, as an avid, I don't say historian, but because that's certainly not what I am, certainly an amateur one perhaps, but somebody who's interested in that kind of aspect of history, it's a sort of a good time to be wading through it.
We see a lot of disconnect in the States down here between our relationship with the First World War and the modern, I guess, social world. There's just people don't know about it. They don't care. It's for us, it's like revolution, Civil War. We killed the Nazis. We don't talk about Vietnam, but we're sorry. And we say thank you to every Vietnam vet we see now. And we're currently forgetting the news cycle. So we tend to focus on these weird moments. And we are fortunate, as you're saying, it's an exciting time because we get to see a number of our colleagues right in front of our eyes doing great works. A colleague of ours, Jim Taub, is recently joined the World War I Museum in Kansas City, and is doing great work, to sort of usher the story of the American Expeditionary Force out to a younger audience that, they're not turned off to the concept of the First World War yet. They're like, for whatever reason that happens here in the States, he's getting to them early. And there's a number of other names we could drop and things like that. But so we agree. It's very exciting. And we get to see it even down here, where we were only involved in the war on the battlefront, very late, in the twilight, so to speak, of the war. And he's doing a good job sort of connecting us with that. So the reason, just to tell our listeners why we've said TFL a couple times, why when we get back into July 1st right here, the reason I wanted to talk about that, and I said as much in the first episode, is because as I read about the first day of the Somme, to me, that what happens in TFL Wood is kind of a microcosm of the entire day. There are small successes. There are major failures. There's a lot that goes on right there. And it's probably the one that most people are going to find easily when they go looking for it. And like, I always want to connect people with the quickest way to get into something, because it's hard to dive deep right away, but if you can get hooked with something right away. So let's jump right into it. Let's get into the rest of what we wanted to talk about July 1st. And then let's leave July 1st in the day behind us. Like you said, they picked up on July 2nd. I got chills when you said that, just because it's such a simple concept, but understanding what they go through on just the first day, you're like, how can there be a July 2nd? But there is. And there's a third and a fourth, and it goes into November. So let's just talk a little bit about July 1st and focus on TFL Wood. We don't need to spend a ton of time on it. I just know our listeners out there are the kind that don't want to just stay at 30,000 feet. So we'll give them a little bit of what happens down on the ground. And then we'll jump back up way into the air, and we'll talk about this overall campaign. And then, if you'll spoil us, please, I want to talk about some Canadians in this battle, because I am endeared to them, and you are a great Canadian. So we want to talk about them, my man. So I'm going to hand the reins over to you. Pick up wherever you'd like. Just take us into July 1st around TFL on your terms, and then go.
So I guess TFL is a little bit north of, I guess, the customary sort of center, the demarcation of the battlefield is the Albert Bapaume Road, which is an old Roman road that's very straight that leads from those two towns. And it is sort of the traditional dividing line between the north and the south. That doesn't necessarily speak to the lay of the ground. And slightly north of that, extending almost at right angles to the sort of the line. Now, the line in the Somme sector is a bit of a lazy S for those that are familiar with the sort of the first day on the Somme map. And Thiepval is a village that's sort of positioned at overlooking on a piece of high ground, sort of the bend of the Ancre River. And the Ancre River runs from sort of the north down, following this sort of lazy S, crosses the front line, and then runs into Albert and away to the sea. So Thiepval, there's a stretch of high ground that extends from this bend in the river and extends eastward generally. Now, when we say high ground, you certainly don't want to think of mountains and massive hills and everything like that. The Somme country is hugely open and very, very rolling. I've been fortunate enough to spend 4 trips now there to the Somme. So, you get a sense of what the ground is like, that you can stand on a hill or on a ridge and, see a great amount of space around you. But you can also stand in the bottom of what appears to be a very shallow valley, and that's all you see. Because the overall nature of the ground is very open. And it is predominantly farmland that is dotted by a huge number of small villages, especially at that time. And these villages, of course, would have supported the farmers and everything that they need to farm the local country. So you've got this sort of sea of farmland with islands of civilization, as it were. And these villages are typical French villages of the area, brick houses, narrow lanes. There's no real pattern to them. There's no sort of grid system set up. They've evolved over many, many, many hundreds of years organically. This part of France has been sort of lived in for millennia.
Oh, quite a
so
while.
These villages have become and built organically as they see fit. And much like any part of the old world, there's a lot of people in these villages who may have grown up in them and never left them, that their whole world is the farm and their village and maybe the next one or something along those lines. So that's the character, the nature of the Somme battlefield. And this high ground that stretches up from the Ancre Valley, as it were. When I say valley, I mean, when you stand there, you can see that it is low, especially at this curve as it comes around in behind Thiepval Wood. It's very swampy. So it's a very slow moving at this point river. And, its banks are quite wide and flushed out with a lot of swamp and, bad ground for any kind of maneuver and traversing for that matter. In the sort of bend of the river, and it is a very lazy bend, is the Thiepval village, which is sort of on this end of the western end of this high feature that is tucked within that curve of the river. So it serves an interesting, and that general area serves as a sort of a real focal point for the battle, because although on the 1st of July, it is essentially a top to bottom effort from the top of the sector to the bottom, and like at 0 hour, everything happens all the way across the front. Primarily the successes that are achieved on the 1st of July are achieved in the southern part. And we can see that those successes primarily are from Thiepval, a little bit south of Thiepval. But what ends up happening is that this southern sector becomes the real main effort of the subsequent fighting, especially again coming through the rest of July and August and into September. that the northern sector doesn't receive as much attention because the successes that were gained on the first are, I guess you could say, perpetuated, and that we've had some success here, let's push here. We had very little success up north, we're going to let that lie and direct all our efforts down here. And that sort of characterizes the fighting on the Somme for the vast majority of it. Thiepval, in terms of the village itself, on the high ground overlooking the river, at the end of this high feature, Thiepval Ridge, as it sort of becomes known as in the context of the fighting on the Somme, it almost becomes the sort of the hub, or not the hub perhaps, but the hinge, the pin in the hinge. Because north of there, the front remains relatively stable, but south, it begins to swing like a door would open as the British are pushing it, with that hinge being at Thiepval. And that hinge remains intact in German hands for quite some time. But the ground south of that, gradually, through Herculean efforts, gets pushed, and the front lines get pushed back. The British are able to achieve, local victories, albeit at great cost. And that door gradually pushes open. So what you end up happening is, with Thiepval remaining constant as a very strong feature, and the supporting defenses around it held by the Germans, that area that is being taken by the British gradually develops and changes the nature of the front line from being essentially north-south, and as it remains in the north that way. But at Thiepval, all of a sudden, within, I shouldn't say all of a sudden, because it does take a long time, a matter of weeks and months for this to happen.
Yes.
Right? But in the greater context of the war, of course, is that the front line, as they fight and push up the Bapaume Road, the front line takes on a different character, which is almost an east-west orientation, hinging on Thiepval. And so the successes that are gained in the early part of the Somme fighting are in the south, and it creates this, let's say, bulge to a degree south of Thiepval. And sort of the in terms of the ground and the fact that Thiepval is such a strongly held, for a number of reasons, location, that it's not until September that they're actually able to take the physical ground that the village at that time doesn't exist anymore, but where it did stand, and the dominance that it held over the ground below it, overlooking the Ancre River Valley. And essentially, in pushing that front line from an east or north-south, south of Thiepval, and reorienting it through the successes they're able to achieve, the fighting in the later parts of the battle, especially as it relates to what we're going to talk about later with the Canadian involvement, takes on a north-south axis. And they're fighting up from the southeast of Thiepval, coming in behind the village and the end of that spur. So rather than attacking it from the front through a huge amount of effort, they actually attack Thiepval from the south.
Wow.
And as they say, that takes sort of 2 months.
Nothing happens quickly on the Western
Front. Or more
front.
than that.
Yeah, nothing happens quickly on the
Sure.
Western front.
Now, Rob,
So
Thiepval,
again, it speaks to the...
I was just going to, my fault. I was just going to say, you'd mentioned that Thiepval is no longer there. Is this one of those French villages that's completely destroyed in the war and is just never rebuilt? We see that at Verdun quite a bit.
That's correct. Exactly. And having been to Verdun myself, what they've done there is they have memorialized the sites of these villages as the whole battlefield is sacred, but in particular, these villages have become extra sacred. To the point where they have gone through, there's nothing rebuilt, but the town of the village site is intact, and there's monuments to the houses and the families that used to live there.
Wow.
And very, very, very poignant when you visit Verdun. And it's different to the Somme in the way the ground has been reclaimed by the forest. It's a different feeling having been in both places. But yes, TFL is completely obliterated. It's right on the front line. That the German trenches of the front line and the first German trench system, of which there's actually 3 in this part of the battlefield, that first system, and I say system because each system has multiple lines of trenches in it, and barbed wire and other machine gun nests and redoubts and bunkers and all this kind of thing. So in the process of the preliminary bombardment and subsequent is the town or the village either is completely obliterated. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean that it's easily taken, because the fact that a house is destroyed doesn't really matter, especially when it pertains to the fact that the basement of that house is now covered in rubble and actually could be stronger, and it gets turned into a shelter, a bunker, and then is connected to the next one beside it with a series of trenches and other ways and avenues, and becomes a strong point unto itself, which perhaps is a good segue to talk about not just the village itself, because it is supported on 3 sides by a series of redoubts. And for those listeners that may be not familiar with that word, it's a bit of an old-timey word, a redoubt being essentially a fort, or a fort in miniature, typically made of earth, but it's a strong point where you would have extra attention paid to bunkers and shelters and extra emplacements for weapons, whether they be machine guns or whatnot, because of the nature of the ground typically. So that you put a redoubt at the top of a spur or a hill that can then dominate the ground around it. But because it's so exposed, you want to put extra fortification to it, extra protection, extra barbed wire, extra trenches, perhaps extra men, extra weapons for sure. So that's essentially the description of what a redoubt is. And to the north of Thiepval, we have the Schwaben Redoubt, which again is this series of trenches that are constructed to support the emplacement of machine guns, which then dominate the Ancre River Valley and also support the location of Thiepval village and the ground below it. To the south, we have the Leipzig Salient, which is another jut in the German line that was created to dominate a piece of ground on a spur, again overlooking the Ancre River Valley and where the British are and where they start from. And then behind, in the German second system, we have Goat Redoubt and Stuff Redoubt, which are part of, as I say, that second German trench system positioned behind. And then we have other examples of areas where this greater battlefield location is supported from different sides and different trenches. I mean, when you look at some photographs and when we start getting into the weeds about the discussion here, I mean, these are hugely complicated systems. It's literally, it's not a straight ditch. Each trench is built to fight from. It's built in with traverses and bays to prevent, to make it harder to fight down should it be attacked, but also to protect individuals in that trench from a shell bursting in the trench, so that splinter effect of anything that explodes in the trench is then limited to that one little area, that a shell splinter can't fly 100 yards down the trench because it bends. And
you're talking about the zigzag effect, right? So if we're looking 30,000 feet down, that's zigzag.
That's right. So as I say, hugely complicated, and then throw in, a zillion miles of barbed wire that crisscross back and forth. And I mean, these redoubts, we think of a fort being something that's tall, with walls and palisades, perhaps in a Western context or something along those lines. These are certainly not that. These are all dug into the ground, but they're bristling with machine guns. And the machine guns that are there are sighted very keenly to cover certain parts of the ground, not necessarily to protect themselves, but to protect other parts of the line, should they be attacked. So if I attacked you over this ground, you might be able to shoot at me, you might not, because of the way the ground folds. But the guy beside you can shoot across your front. And now, as I'm trying to attack you, I'm getting it from the right. And in some parts of the line, I'm getting it from the right, the left, and the front. So you can see the nature and the reason why these positions are occupied and why they're so intensely fortified, because they're very important pieces of ground that are key to the defense of the greater battlefield area. So, Tiepville is an immensely strong position. It's high ground that overlooks the Ancre River Valley, which is where the British trenches are. It has these redoubts north and south and behind, all of which will support generally that part of the line and mutually. So I can shoot across your front and you can shoot across mine. If we're destroyed or we're covered in smoke or been put to ground by artillery fire, you may be able to help us because you can shoot across our front through our barbed wire while they're trying to get through it. And the bullets will come from, they don't know where they're coming from because they're not coming from their front, but all of a sudden the machine gun, the bullets are coming from their left as you're trying to go this way, So as I say, it's almost scientific in nature, some of these locations that you look at the angles, and I see why they want to hold this piece of ground because it covers that valley. And I can see why they're over there because it covers behind us in some ground that we are vulnerable from. Those kinds of discussions and examinations go on and on and on. So as a general location is very strong, and each individual locality there that we've talked about, the redoubts and the village itself, is also very strong. So, the reason why it becomes this sort of hinge pin of the subsequent British efforts is because of the nature of this. And it takes the compromise of that ground behind it to actually take the end of the spur at Tiepville. So the task to take this general area, the Tiepville sort of sector, as it were, falls on 10 Corps. And I know we talked a little bit about organization in the first part. Right. A corps is a level above a division, but below an army. And in British terms, a corps is an organization with some dedicated troops, artillery, perhaps some other supporting arms that stay with the corps headquarters, but they are an organization that manages divisions. And these divisions belong to the corps only for limited amounts of time. That if this particular corps, in this case 10 Corps, it attacks with 2 divisions up, which is sort of the military way of describing that. There is a 3rd division held in reserve that is held out of the action immediate on the first, and the 2 divisions are the 36th Ulster Division on the left and the 32nd Division on the right. And this corps is responsible for the attack at Tiepville, south into the Leipzig salient, and north towards the Schwaben Redoubt. And its left-hand boundary is the River Ancre, with all that swampy area that really is not navigable and is like nobody on either side really wants to get bogged down in there. But of course, the Germans have the high ground overlooking it. Right. So the British forces are going to have to leave their trenches, cross no man's land, and climb this slope to get up to these locations. And it's this one sector is a real study in success and failure. I might not be completely out of line to say that the action of the 36th Ulster Division tends to get more attention. The Ulster Memorial there is this massive tower that's been subsequently built to commemorate the action fought by the 36th Division. So it has a prominent, it's this big stone tower on the battlefield. And it sees astounding initial success on the day. And its job is to attack the Schwaben Redoubt, which is that strong point on a spur supporting the location of the village of Tiepville to the north. And they make some arrangements, the commander, to make sure that they're pushed right out into no man's land just at the end of the bombardment, so that when the bombardment lifts, the idea is that there's not a lot of space to cover. I know we talked a little bit about that last time,
right?
But this really works for the 36th Division, and they're able to essentially storm across the Schwaben Redoubt and take it, which is to the north, and sort of extends that system extends beyond Tiepville village. And they actually have elements that reach the German second line or the second system, quite some distance behind, near Stuff Redoubt. And there's actually 2 Victoria Crosses won by members of the division. And as they say, that initial success is stunning. They just walk over the Germans. And I say walk. They're moving quickly. The race to the parapet is a phrase that's used a lot to describe this type of fighting. When that barrage lifts, if you take too long to get out of your trenches or to get to the German trenches, they'll beat you out of their bunkers into their trenches, set up their machine guns, and all of a sudden now you're
dead.
You're screwed.
You're dead. Yeah. Just speak it plain. You're likely dead.
So
Rob,
this
just to be clear, when it comes to Schwaben Redoubt, Stuff Trench, Goat Trench, things like that, these are all code names or names that have been attributed to them by the British. This is not what the Germans are calling them. Is that correct? There's German words for them. These names of the redoubt. I'm just trying to think if there's some examples.
Schwaben sounds pretty German to me.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good point.
Right. So the point I'm trying to make is they're sometimes they're anglicized version of what the Germans may call them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Dear
so
goat.
Sure. Every trench except goat. Yeah. Almost every trench has a name, and
right.
Typically the British would have names for the German trenches because that's the way they referred to them. Your job is to, attack this trench between this and this trench, because it's like almost like a road system, right? There's intersections and there's chunks of the line and this kind of thing. And the same goes for the British trenches. They all have names so that they can navigate this maze of ditches in the ground. You see a lot of signs with references to the troops that perhaps built that trench or occupied it for a long time, give it a known local name from where they're from. So if they're from London, you might have London-based names like Piccadilly Circus or something like that, and that kind of thing. Or later on, we see a lot of, we'll talk about the Canadian involvement. The trenches take on Canadian names, like Regina Trench, which is a town in Saskatchewan, which is a province in Canada.
I knew that it was in Saskatchewan. You got it out quicker than I could say it. I was like, I know where that is. I learned this was a lesson for me when I first started to really ingratiate myself into the First World War. I kept reading that the 85th Battalion prior to stepping out of Vimy was in Music Hall Line. And I'm like, why are they in a music hall? I was like, what the heck is this? And then I was like, oh, that's the name of the trench they're in.
For sure. And the trenches at Vimy, we are jumping away from the Somme here, but we'll talk about that battle. I mean, at that point, 1917, things are becoming very formalized. And in terms of the attack at Vimy, there's every little square foot of ground almost has a name, so that I can tell you that you need to be here. And every trench has its specific name, and they're all alphabetized from north to south, so that the trenches in the north start with A. The trenches, as you go through, begin with C and onwards. And when you get to the south in the first division sectors, the letter escapes me. But the whole front is broken into designations in that degree of formality. So, there's a lot of famous locations on the Somme. White City is a bit north of this part of the battlefield we're talking about. That's adjacent to Beaumont-Hamel, sort of in the north where the Hawthorne Ridge mine crater goes off. Given to the fact that it's extensively fortified and dug, and on the Somme, when you dig, below the soil, the topsoil is chalk.
Right. And
so if you dig more than just a couple of feet, you're going to hit this really hard. It's chocolate. They're kind of chalky right on the chalkboard. It's hard. It's white, and it's very separate, distinct from the soil that's on the top. So when you dig out the ground and dig your trench out, all you're digging through is this white chalk, and so you've got to throw it somewhere. And now everywhere you see it, especially when you look at the Somme and battlefield pictures, especially panoramic ones, you can see there's just a big, huge line of white. And especially when you look at aerial photographs, every trench, that castellated nature we talked about, the zigzag piece, is that it's defined. The dark of the trench from the aerial shot is defined. You can see the dark, but it's defined by the white around it.
I was going to say the dark isn't a shadow. The dark is the trench.
That's right. And it's made more prominent because the soil that you're digging out of that trench is white.
Think about the movie 1917, right? There's that whole scene where they finally make it down to the second Devons and he's running. And this is probably a scene somewhere along this line, maybe in 1917, obviously, but they're digging out all the white stuff. The trenches look like they're made of pearls
or snow. Yeah.
Right. And it's pronounced, it's white. And the modern day, the vestiges are very, well, to the trained eye, they can pick them out. And I'm by no means one of them. But you can see when you walk down the roads that border these fields on the Somme, you can see that there's chunks of white in the soil. And that chalk only gets to the surface one way, and that's digging. It doesn't just sort of erode and sort of permeate up through, because it's I say soil. It's hard. You have to pick it with a pickaxe. So, but for years up until I'm trying to think of the last sort of pictures, certainly into the 50s and 60s, you'd see this from an aerial shot. Trenches have long been filled in and the farmland is returned to its proper use and been cultivated and farmed, and it's growing their carrots and or whatever they are. But from the aerial shot, you can see this white scar that traverses across the field and carries on up this way. And that's the vestige of that trench that was dug and it being filled in. But all this chalk then that was taken out of the ground and put on the surface, and then through many years and months of it being shelled and churned up and everything, it's on the surface now. And despite the fact that it's all been pushed back in to fill the trench in, many years after, it's still got this white scar across the ground, where in a part of the field where there was no trench, there's no white or very little. So it's this really weird kind of last vestige of something that happened over 100 years ago, completely man-made. And one of these kind of things, especially when you're able to visit a place like the Somme, you really you get immersed into it. There's so much to take in around these areas, for sure. I know we're getting a little tangenty here.
Well, it's poetically appropriate, though. It's literally a scar, like we have scars today. That's actually a really good description, Rob.
Yeah. So we talk about the 36th Division and their role sort of in the ground north of Thiepval village, and with the primary sort of goal of taking the Schwaben Redoubt and a little town that's right on the riverbank called Saint-Pierre-d'Yvon. And their primary success is getting across no man's land and getting into the Schwaben Redoubt and overrunning it. Now, the success they find in those first moments of the battle don't last long. And the Germans, as characteristically, we might say, focus a lot of attention in counterattacking. Obviously, they've sustained loss in that particular area, and it's a very important part of their defensive system. So it's not something they're going to just give up on or even lightly attempt to. They're going to hit hard, and they do. And by the end of the day one, the 36th Division is pushed right back, not quite to their start line, but they're only holding on to the frontline trench, not the trench system of which the Schwaben Redoubt is part of, but literally that first trench of the system. So they're pushed almost right back to where they start. It's something that's often repeated throughout the wars, that an interesting technique or an advance in technology allows something to happen that is uncharacteristic of what else has happened, left and right or before or after immediately. And then it's sort of victory so close. And then there's an aspect that is unable to be accommodated for. In this case, the German counterattacks and the attention they put to trying to take back that piece of ground. And as they say, they are essentially successful in doing so. And that kind of, it taints the successes that they were able to achieve in those first moments of 1st of July. Interestingly enough, the division neighboring them to the south, the 32nd Division, have similar orders upon the cessation of the barrage to, or as the end of the barrage approaches, I should say, is to move out into no man's land, even as close as 50 yards from exploding shells of your own exploding shells, so that that race to the parapet can happen. But it's not as successful. And the 32nd Division sustains heavy loss attempting to cross no man's land and get into the German trench system. So it's an interesting sort of dichotomy here, is that in one sense, this aspect is what's used chiefly to attribute the success or even the local success. But in other areas, the same technique is tried and it doesn't work. The Germans beat them to the parapet. Fire from elsewhere, from up at Thiepval village and parts of the line, are able to cover, like we talked about earlier, is this sort of mutual support of the various positions along the line. So almost the entire frontage of the division is unsuccessful in achieving their objectives. They are able to get a toehold in the Leipzig salient, which is this system of trenches that extends south of Thiepval on a bit of a spur. Not quite to the degree that the 36th Division is able to attack and hold. And you can't, I mean, if that's the success that you want to call the success, there it is. But if you look at the minute you take a step back from looking at the microscopic view, you realize that, so little that you could actually call a success. That yes, they got across no man's land in a very small part and they were able to hold on to a trench. But that's the frontage of 10 Corps, those two divisions. And they're able, in one sense, on the left, to achieve a great success initially, but then are beaten back. And on the right, they launch their attack and it's beaten off almost immediately. Yeah. There's attempts made to reinforce the success that may or may not have happened with their reserve division, which is the 49th Division. And they're pushed up. You might imagine it's something that's often repeated, but we have to know that this is just one of those factors of fighting, especially at this time in the war, where if you're trying to move troops forward during a battle, it's like salmon swimming upriver with bears and fishermen all along the way, because not only are they going to be under German shell fire and machine gun fire, but they're having to navigate, and they're the fresh troops that are going forward to perpetuate an attack or reinforce success or maybe stave off defeat, that kind of thing. And they're trying to get forward through this trench system, the friendly trench system. But the friendly trench system is being used to evacuate wounded, of which there are a considerable number, as we've talked about on the 1st of July. Their only way to safety and to where they need to go, the dressing stations, the collection points, and on past that to hospitals and whatnot far behind the lines. But they're being ferried back down these communication trenches, which are not massive avenues that you can drive wagons down. They're as wide as maybe a man or two. And now trying to wrestle a stretcher with a wounded man on it, with a guy at the front and the guy at the back, and times that by dozens and dozens, and then put all the stuff in the trench that you would find there. The revetting that may have been blown in by German shell fire, and then try and feed a single file of men to go up it with who are the fresh troops that are going to take up the attack from the point at which it's been left. So when I say salmon swimming upstream, that has to be the best sort of analogy, is that there's this tidal wave of friction coming back at you, whether it's German fire or it's friendly casualties, and trying to navigate that to get up just to the point where you can start your attack. This happens in 10 Corps, trying to get the 49th Division up and to help with what is perceived to be some success. It doesn't work out. And essentially, the long story short in this sector is that apart from those two little parts of the line I alluded to, of the Schwaben Redoubt and then the Leipzig salient, the British are essentially left holding their front line like they had at the beginning of the 1st of July. So interestingly enough, we did talk about the Newfoundlanders last episode, And that point, that navigation, that salmon swimming upriver, that's exactly their situation, although on a slightly smaller scale. We're not divisions pushing through divisions, but we're talking about reserve battalions pushing up through the assaulting battalions. And that's the sort of like the same situation in microcosm that the Newfoundlanders found. And they couldn't get up through their trenches to get to the front line to launch the attack. And their decision, right or wrong, was to get out of the trenches and move across the top of the ground just so they could get to where they needed to be. And, it's a very sad story. The whole front at that point is sad. That the battalions left and right of the Newfoundlanders and in front of them, they were trying to do the same thing. And they all got, punished severely. I don't say punished in the sense that they deserved it, but they were put into the attack and they all suffered to the same general degree. I think perhaps the salient part about the Newfoundlanders is that there's, it's actually a piece of Canada now. Then they weren't part of Canada, but now they are, and Newfoundland being a province. And there's a park called, the Newfoundland Park. And the sacrifice made by the Newfoundlanders there is memorialized there. But it's also important to realize the context they were operating in. They weren't by themselves. That there were battalions in front of them that were, suffered horrendously, similarly to what the Newfoundlanders suffered. And so it's important always to put it in a slightly bigger picture, I think. And what we see in 10 Corps is that essentially the same thing at a bigger scale. We're trying to move thousands of men, not just hundreds now, to get up to push the attack forward. So, as I mentioned, that essentially is the story of 10 Corps on the first day. And after the first day, as we talked about at the beginning of this episode, is that they pick up on the second. And when I say they, I mean the Army in general. They don't just stop and say, well, we tried, we didn't make it.
Yeah, campaign over.
Exactly.
Campaign over.
We'll hold on to what we've got, and we'll sort of cut our losses. No. This is a major campaign with major objectives, and also there's major support put to it. There's asset. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of men that haven't been committed on the first day yet, even. And all the stockpiles of ammunition, they're ready to go the long haul here. This isn't a one-shot deal. It happens to be that first shot had they had intended it to be very successful and capture the third German trench system on the first day. That was what the objectives were. Well, they never got really close to that at all. I mean, they had snips into the second system, but weren't able to stay there. Because left and right flanks are in the air, fire coming from all around, all that kind of stuff. And that's what happens at the Schwalben Redoubt, the 36th Divisions. They fight through the Schwalben Redoubt and beyond, and then they find themselves all by themselves. They're all alone, and there's Germans left, Germans front, Germans right, and the position they have, it becomes untenable with fire coming in from all these directions, and casualties mount, and pretty soon there's no other course of action other than to leave. Other than that, we're just going to die here because that's what's happening. And we can see that around us. We're taking casualties. They're closing in around us, part of their counterattacking, and there's no one around to help us on the flanks, on our left and our right, because they haven't had the same kind of success that we have. And so that plays into a major part of the reason why the counterattacks that the Germans put on the Schwalben Redoubt and the efforts of the 36th Division, that's why part of the reason is that they are fought back, is because it's like they've punched on a very narrow frontage, quite deep, but the people beside them, the river on one side and the 32nd Division, haven't been able to sort of match that and secure their flanks. It's a constant struggle in this type of, during the Great War, is that these local successes end up not being successes because of the people left and right. And it's just the nature of warfare. You need this broad front success in order to achieve what you want in terms of capturing ground or whatnot. You need to support left and right. because if not, you just create a salient, just a bulge in the line, which from the Ypres salient to the salient essentially created by the 36th Division to the Battle of the Bulge in World War II, it's called that for a reason, is that when you punch into a line and you maybe even break through, you've created this bulge, but now you're vulnerable on three sides. Right. It's an age-old military problem that to date, there's only one solution to that, and that is those flanks, the sides of the bulge, need to be pushed out, and that bulge needs to be flattened so that the people in the middle of the bulge or at the top of the bulge aren't surrounded on three sides.
I feel like this is a time to take a shot at General Dan Sickles, but I'm not going to. But I feel like this is an apt moment, like looking at you.
No,
he does exactly the same thing, doesn't he? Because he decides that he's going to march his. He was a corps commander, if I'm not.
Yep,
correct.
Third Corps.
Yeah, and he marched way out. That's the whole cornfield evolution and the peach orchard, right?
Yep,
correct.
Yep,
peach orchard. Yep.
Yeah, and the peach orchard, and again on three sides, right?
Yep. We got colleagues and friends of ours in a podcast up in Gettysburg. They have a very strong community, and Matt and I are Maryland campaign Antietam nerds, and so we always like to twist the knife and needle our friends up there and tell them that we're the real high watermark of the Confederacy for the Civil War and all this stuff. And taking shots at everything Gettysburg is just kind of a fun thing we do. So Dan Sickles, looking at you.
Regardless, though, it's a good example
absolutely.
Of a bulge. Yeah.
Couple things real quick here. So one, I was getting strong kind of like Sisyphus vibes as you were describing the moving up and then falling back.
You.
Dude, I'm a literary guy, what can I say? I like the old Greek stories. But the story of Sisyphus, he's pushing the rock up the hill, he gets to the top of the hill, the rock, and they all go back down to the bottom and rinse and repeat. The story never gets any better. And I feel like with the First World War, obviously almost anywhere you look between 14 and 18, this is kind of the experience, but specifically, talking about, I guess, launching this campaign, there was a lot of expectations. We've pushed this rock, we, especially with the 36, we've moved across, we got to the we did our job, but it doesn't really matter because the rock's now back down to the hill. We're back in our sort of original holdings when we're picking up on July 2nd. And we're recording this around the time of the Winter Olympics here in 2022. And I was also thinking they had high expectations like Michaela Schifrin and the American downhill skier. And then we fell 11 seconds into the race and our gold medal was lost. But I don't want to take that shot. Go USA, win us a bunch of golds, baby. So my real question, moving the conversation along, is with all of this chaos, which is a good word, but an understated word for what the July 1st experience was like for the BEF. On July 2nd, is there just confusion reigning between casualties, like positions of troops? Are units mixed up? Because that's something I've seen in a number of the dramatizations is guys get sort of confused on the field. And then you got guys from this unit mixed in with this unit for a couple of days as they're sorting all this out. Is there just confusion reigning, or is there a plan hey, July 1st, it was a wash. July 2nd, this is our plan now. Were they right into something, or was there a, while the bullets are firing, we still need to figure some things out kind of moment?
Yes.
Okay, fair.
The battle's launched with a plan, with a series of objectives, and this is how we're going to achieve it. And that's what goes into action on the 1st of July. There is plans that, to break through and be able to exploit that sort of success as was planned for. The fact that it didn't occur is something that the plan rapidly shifts. Is that obviously the troops that attacked on the 1st of July were not going to be able to attack all the way to back home and beyond. They're humans. They can only last so long in action before running out of ammunition, but also getting too tired and becoming exhausted. So they're going to have to be replaced with fresh troops. That's the whole nature of having divisions in reserve that you can push through and forward and perpetuate attacks. So as much as the initial sort of textbook objectives for the day were, hugely optimistic, especially in retrospect, but covered all the way to the 3rd German line to sort of seize the entire section of the German defenses in that part of France and be able then have nothing beyond that. That's that sort of stereotypical breakthrough scenario. It is the army in action launching a campaign, a big main effort kind of battle. So the fact that the first day does not go anywhere close to what was hoped for, what had been planned for, and in the vast majority of cases, except in the very sort of the southern part where there is some sustained local success, you have to know that after that first day that there's a lot of navel gazing going on. It's like, oh boy, this did not work out for us. Now what are we going to do? The job here was not just to throw a punch, but it was to win a boxing match. So you don't win a boxing match by hanging out, throwing one punch, and if it works, great. But if it doesn't, wait for the bell to ring? No.
If you're going to throw one punch in a boxing match, you better be Mike freaking Tyson. And you better land it. And you better be like vintage mid-1980s Mike Tyson, because if you're like Mike Tyson 1995 or later, you got to throw a second punch. You have to, or bite somebody's ear. Jesus.
And continue to do that, right?
Yes,
for sure.
Don't bite anybody's ear out there. Just for our listeners, don't do that. It was weird when he did it. It's still weird now.
Right. I just brought up a list here of sort of just to put in perspective. So the fighting at the beginning on the 1st of July is within the context. And this is off of a website called the Long Trail, which is a sort of a research website regarding the Great War and the British Army in the Great War. The Battle of Albert is a term used to describe the 1st of July, that first initial effort. And that fighting sort of carries on until the 13th of July. So as I say, when they picked up on the 2nd, they took stock of what was going on and moved forward with a sort of let's try here again. Or we had success here. We'll immediately shift the effort, and those divisions in that corps or those corps will attack again very shortly thereafter. So that first initial battle, the Battle of Albert, there's a subsidiary attack on a GOM corps on the north, which is sort of this, not a diversion, because usually diversions happen before, but it's taken on by the Third Army. And it's sort of a subsidiary attack north of the Somme sector. The Bazentin Ridge from the 14th to the 17th of July. We have the attack at Fromelles from the 19th to 20th July. The attacks on Highwood from 20 to 25 July. The Delville Wood from 15 July to 3 September. So we're talking 3 weeks of fighting here around these locations. And then the Battle of Pozières, which is a village on the Bapaume Road. And that's from the 23rd of July to the 3rd of September. We have the Battle of Guimont from the 3rd to the 6th of September. The Battle of Vichy, the 9th of September. So some of these are local actions. This battle I've just mentioned in particular involves 3 divisions, right? Whereas, in other battles, there's a dozen or so. And perhaps we can keep this as a reference for later, but the Battle of Flers-Courcelette, yes. which is a double-barreled name, those 2 locations being 2 villages, Flers and Courcelette. From the 15th to the 22nd of September, which is a fairly large action. The fighting around Morval, which is the 25th to the 28th of September. The Battle of Thiepval Heights from the 26th to the 28th of September. I mean, the list is going on and on. Transloy from the 1st to the 18th of October. I mean, now we're 3 months into it, aren't we?
Yeah.
The fighting on the Ancre Heights from the 1st to the 11th of October. The Battle of the Ancre, which is north of the river now, not south, from the 13th to the 18th of November. And at that point, sort of the Somme, the Battle of the Somme, the greater Battle of the Somme, sort of comes to its conclusion. So, I didn't make a count there, but I'm sure some of your listeners have dozed off to sleep as I started listing the names of all the actions, the battles that were within the greater battle.
None of our listeners sleep. We have only riveting guests. They were hanging on every word of
riveting.
it. Well, I gotta ask.
They may stay up to listen to you.
That's right. I gotta ask you a question, man. Do you just have to make a decision when you're studying the First World War to just say things in French with confidence? Because like you're slinging out all these like French names and with all these strong, like every time I'm about to say something remotely French, I get nervous and I'm like, Bapaume Road. I'm like, you're out there. Like is it a decision you just make? I'm going to be confident with my French, whether I'm right or wrong.
Sure. There's confidence and there's competence, right? I'm not going to claim either.
I think I have confidence.
Best ask somebody French. But okay. a good example is the pronunciation of Thiepval, right? Yeah, some people say Thiepval, some people say Thiepval. Those are sort of anglicized and like a Franco way of pronouncing that location, either which is going to be understood by anybody who has sort of any interest in the battle. They'll know the location you're talking about.
Well, Ypres, wipers. That's another one of those. Yeah. That's like, it's got 800 different ways to pronounce. Passchendaele spelled 1,000 different ways. Not right. Really.
Well, and of course, and that's not a French word. Those are Belgium. That's a Flemish word, right?
That's right.
So, like in the modern, in asking people, it's Yepper.
That's a new one. I've never even heard that one. Yepper.
And it's spelled Ieper.
What are these people from Minnesota, Wisconsin?
Like Ypres is the French, is my understanding anyway, and we're out a bit of a tangent, but Ypres or Ypres is a sort of a French version of the name. And obviously, English soldiers or British soldiers or Canadian, Western soldiers that arrive there, they don't know how to pronounce these names, especially in Flanders, where it's all Flemish names. Right. So they don't know how to pronounce them. And they come up with their own.
Vipers.
There's a town that's south, I believe, or is it north of Messines, which is south of Ypres. And I can't even pronounce the actual name, but it was known as White Sheet because that was the closest resemblance in English that they could come up with. So everyone just knew it as White Sheet or Wipers. They all knew it as Wipers because that was the easiest way that they could remember. So, I mean, there's the famous newspaper that was published called the Wipers Times. And that was the soldiers' newspaper in that area and that in the salient. So, yeah, I don't throw French around very confidently at all. So I should say there's competence and there's confidence. I wouldn't attest to either, but
we like it, Rob. I do have a question for you though, in regards to this series of battles that you've laid out for us in regards to the Somme campaign. How is the British, or I should say, the United Kingdom's military structure adjusting to having these multi-day, multi-week, sometimes multi-month engagements or battles within these larger campaigns? Because this is not how the army was designed to fight at the beginning of the First World War. It's not how anybody's armies were designed to fight at the beginning of the First World War. And they've all had to undergo this massive sea change in how we even view battles at this point. Can you speak on that at all? It's just a really interesting concept to me.
Well, the Somme represents the southern part of the line held by the BEF at this particular time. That to the right, which we haven't really talked a little bit about, I think we talked a little bit in the first episode, immediately south of the British Somme sector is where the French part of the line picks up and carries on all the way to Switzerland. So that demarcation shifts as the war progresses, and the British take on more parts of the line, et cetera, and sort of extend to the south primarily. But the Battle of the Somme is sustained through the use of non-committed troops. So if these divisions have been committed to, let's say, the 1st of July and they're completely cut up, or maybe they've got I hesitate to use such sort of flippant analogies like they got a bloody nose. I mean, we're talking about men's lives here, and that's important to understand. But if a unit sustained 10% casualties, that's a huge out of let's just say 1,000, they sustain 100 casualties. That would be a significant loss. At the time, give that unit a bit of rest, or are they able to continue doing what they're doing? Have they been attrited to the point where everybody is physically exhausted, or there's simply not enough of them to carry on with the task they've been given? So there are units that, not every unit sustains 75% casualties on the first day of the Somme. Like, that's just physically, it doesn't happen. That might be the perception, especially when we talk about, the attack at Beaumont Hamel and the Newfoundlanders, losing a huge percentage of their strength in one effort in one day. But the reality of it is that there are units that were uncommitted or lightly committed, or simply got that bloody nose in the efforts to try and attain their objectives and were forced back. But, give them a night of rest and give them some more ammunition and let them organize themselves and, fill in the blanks and the ranks sort of thing. That maybe C Company got hit really hard, but you know what? D Company was in reserve and they barely got any action, and as a result, very few casualties. Well, we're going to send a platoon from them over and flush C Company out. At least C Company can operate. They're not full strength. Nobody's at full strength anymore, but we've sort of redistributed the manpower within the battalion, and we can still function. We have command structure in place. We still have officers and NCOs that can command, and given a bit of time to take stock, make those arrangements. Yeah, okay, we're ready. We'll be good to go for tomorrow afternoon.
See that?
Well, what? Tomorrow afternoon is not good enough. It's going to be tomorrow morning. So you better get your proverbial together.
Yeah.
So you've got all night. Find your guys, get them organized, because you have to go into the attack again tomorrow morning.
So from a research perspective, that's super crazy for me, because you can have a platoon from Company C reinforce Company A, maybe for a morning attack. Are they maybe returned back to their company? So if you're trying to track down somebody day to day, it can almost be impossible, because are they writing these things down? Are these verbal orders that are being issued? For tomorrow morning, first platoon's going with Company A, but are they logging that and recording that? Because I imagine a lot gets lost in the mud, pun intended, when trying to track down the day-to-days of who's fighting where. Because like you said, if Company D didn't get destroyed and they can afford the guys, are they permanently now transferred to Company C? Or is that, I guess what I'm asking you is this creating a record keeping nightmare? For those of us 100 years later trying to study this?
Right. It depends on the adjutant. At the battalion, war diaries were kept at the battalion level and on up. So brigades kept war diaries, divisions kept war diaries. The lowest level that war diaries were kept was at battalion level. Were there exceptions, and were there other diaries kept at company level? Maybe, I don't know. But typically, in terms of researching, the lowest level you'll come across, especially in Canadian context, is going to be battalion level. So was done by the adjutant or another member at battalion headquarters. And it all depends on that person and how much detail, right? Because it was all handwritten, maybe typed later, but there was a specific form that had to be filled out, and it was just a series of lines, a war diary form, and you wrote the date in the margin on the left, and then you wrote however much you needed to write for that day. So if nothing happened that day, and you get some entries and it's one sentence, was that in billets, all quiet, work party of 200 sent to the line, and that's all that happened that day. The rest of the battalion was resting in billets or doing interior economy or recon, whatever it was. And then other entries, you'll get 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 lines, because it was the part of an attack, or they were involved in a lot of things that day. And the guy who was writing the war diary just jotted it all down and wrote it. So things like that, the battlefield reorganizations, moving people between their companies, the commanding officer of a battalion, typically a lieutenant colonel, it's his battalion. And if one of his companies has been, badly mauled, If he needs to do so, he certainly has the provision to move people around. As you might imagine, moving people around within an organization of nominally 1,000 men, it's not something you want to take lightly, because those people are familiar with the people that they work with. And if you take them out of their world and put them over here with another company with a different commander, a different understanding, they may know the person, but they don't work with the person every day. There's going to be a bit of friction in learning the way, I like you to be on my left all the time. Okay, the guy I was just with, he wanted to be on the right all the time. So now I got to get used to the way you do things. These are the kinds of things, the friction that might be experienced, but there would certainly be provision to do that. Another aspect to that would be simply that if one of my companies was badly cut up, well, I'm just going to keep who's ever left in reserve, and we'll take that company that was in reserve yesterday, who didn't really see much action, and now they're going to lead, right? And by that rotation piece, we now have the ability to sustain larger action for longer periods of time. And that principle is used all the way up to corps level. And as a matter of fact, on the Somme, it's even done at the army level, that the Fourth Army attacking on the Somme has behind it, quote unquote, the reserve army. And that comes into play later in the battle. And it actually becomes, it's given that name because its job is to feed reinforcements and further effort into the fight. And what ends up happening is that actually it takes over part of the line, and the forces are redistributed between the Fourth and the Reserve Army. And in, I believe it's October, the Reserve Army, and we're talking tactical army, like command structure army, not, the British Army, but army being one level above corps. So a collection of corps, which is a collection of divisions. It actually becomes the Fifth Army, and it's renamed in October. So the British BEF has 5 armies in the field, right? So that principle of rotation, only leading with a percentage of your strength at all levels, is the way that fighting essentially has been done since the middle of the 19th century. Like if you look way back in the past, even say at the Battle of the Alma, which is a Crimean War battle fought in 1854, very traditional, very Napoleonic. But even in the Napoleonic era, the fact that the whole army in one line is very uncommon. That even by that point, your one line, you should have somebody behind them, another series of battalions to support them, to either reinforce the success, to help provide physical and moral support around you. But also, if you're going into the attack, that first unit is going to sustain casualties, and maybe they get stopped just a little bit or held up. But if they only had just a few more reinforcements, that supporting element can push up to stabilize the situation to the point where it can push on and continue the attack. So the concept of this support and this rotation and this layering of troops in depth, not just across in linear fashion, goes back in time a long way, and is certainly the way things operate by the Great War. Is that if you have a battalion of 4 companies of about 1,000, let's say 200 in each company, you don't attack with 4 companies in line, each company with its platoons in line, like a big, huge, like too deep, expansive manpower. You'll have 2 companies up, and each company will only have 2 platoons forward and 2 platoons slightly behind. So you can see that every element of that attacking force is going to have depth to it, because they realize, and has been realized for a very long time in the past, is that if you just pack everyone in front and send one effort forward, that if you're not successful, you're done.
Right.
But also the chances of you succeeding, especially as the battlefield, as time goes on and improvements in weaponry occur throughout the 19th into the 20th century, like where we're at right now in 1916, you physically can't do that. If you just put everyone shoulder to shoulder in 2 ranks, like Civil War style, American Civil War style, there's just not a chance you're going to sustain any kind of success, and you're just going to get everybody killed. So coming out of that middle of the 1800s, the battlefield starts loosening up. The spacing of troops on the battlefield starts becoming greater because of the nature of the firepower that they're facing. And by the time of the Great War, this idea that the attack needs to have a depth, and there's never a prescription specifically, but at the company level, those platoons, your platoons will have 4 sections. Each platoon could have 2 sections in the first wave and 2 sections of sort of 15 to 20 guys in each, 2 sections behind them, 50 yards behind them. And that's the platoon. And then there's a similarly positioned platoon beside them, which is the rest of the company. And then there's the 2 platoons behind, which themselves are organized into 2 different lines. So you've got this layered effect that the front guys may, they're going to be the first into the action, into the fight. They're going to sustain casualties, but having people behind it necessarily aren't committed to that action. That are still free to move, perhaps, and reinforce, add firepower, or add impetus to an advance, across no man's land or through a position. If you think of 10 guys fighting down a trench, as they fight down and come around the corner, the first guy gets hit, but the guy right behind him steps around the corner, throws a grenade, kills the guy at the other end, and they're able to move forward. But now there's only 9. And they get to the next corner, the same thing happens. They can still go, but now there's only 8. At some point, they're going to need help, right? And that help comes from the section behind them, who's waiting to support them. And as you say, that's the concept here that we see across the entire gamut of fighting in the Great War. It's done in different ways. In middle of the war, 1916, they very much rely on this kind of technique of just waves. So the idea is this homogeneous advance. Right? Now, these waves are in single rank, but there's multiples of them, one behind the other.
Well, I was going to say, as you're talking, right, as our listeners are listening to this episode, it's August, it is beach time. You're probably listening to this episode with a margarita or a pina colada on the beach, because that's what you want to do when you're enjoying summer, is you want to listen to, horrible warfare in the Somme. No, people want to listen to us while they're driving to vacation.
Right.
But no, my point being is, while you're on the beach, one of the things you might not be aware of is you're sitting around a different kind of war zone. This is Mother Nature against itself. So my father lives down in the Outer Banks. We just did this in quarter 1 of our season 3 here. They deal with beach erosion constantly. Well, what is beach erosion? It is the erosion, the wearing away of the coastline due to the waves, the consistency with which the ocean never stops coming. There's one wave that hits the shore, and then there's another wave, and there's another wave, and there's another wave, and it never stops. Mother Nature, the land, the earth, the continent could probably handle a single wave. But the fact is the waves never, ever stop coming. And so it is destroying the ocean is, especially in terms of the Outer Banks, the ocean is going to be successful. And that's kind of what I was imagining as you were describing what these sort of attacks are starting to turn into. Instead of having just the one big wave come, now we have another one and another one and another one and another one and another one. And it never stops.
Grind it down.
Yeah. That's what it is. I guess the goal is to grind down your opposition.
It's a way to describe certainly that aspect or that technique for sure. But it's also important to realize that in many locations, there's more tactical nuance.
Of course.
That we talk about the 36th Division, and they're pushing out into no man's land and rushing the German defenses. Just by the nature of what happens there, are you going to be able to sustain some sort of nicely dressed off, line of men, one moving into no man's land under your own barrage in the wee hours of the morning, trying to be quiet, and then when that barrage lifts, to get up and go? So, it only lasts so long. But by the Somme, there's also the introduction, not perhaps at the overall army doctrinal level, as it becomes much later for sure, but there are examples of troops moving in a completely different way, in single file, or Indian file, they used to call it, to navigate through gaps in wire, to use folds in the ground, whereas if my 20 guys were in a big line marching forward in a wave, as it were, that, the middle would come to the top of a hill and they would be exposed. But why don't I just keep everyone over here in this little fold of the ground, and we can almost get up to the wire before they're going to see us, that kind of thing. So it's not quite as sort of automaton as talking about waves and perpetual waves coming. It's important to realize that there's a lot more instances of better tactical nuance demonstrated. Perhaps a good example of this is the film taken on the first day by Jeffrey Mallins, with his filming of the Hawthorne crater explosion and subsequent advance by British troops. So Andy Robertshaw, who's a historian, he's done a lot of work on television along with others as well. The Somme is his self-professed sort of go-to area of expertise. I've had the pleasure of talking on the Somme with Andy personally, face to face. And I mean, talk about a wealth of knowledge. So, if I can remember, 10% of what he's forgotten about the Somme, I'll be lucky. So he made a documentary quite some time ago trying to figure out exactly where that film was taken from on the Somme. And they got it down to within a couple of yards of the exact spot, based on camera angles, based on the way the ground was laid out, where the explosion took place, right down and looking at the ground immediately in front of the camera. And so they were very accurate in being able to determine that, which is, to me, that I really gravitate to stuff like that, like finding out to the yard or meter of where this took place or that took place, because there's the technology out there that you can do that now. Anyway, in this, they're watching the film, which he took on that day. Another clips of it are the Lancashire Fusiliers in the Sunken Road, which was taken not far from where he filmed the explosion from. And it's a very famous clip that you'd more than likely be familiar with. It's bushes on either side, a sunken lane, and there's guys lined up and they're smoking and waiting to go over the top on the 1st of July. And this sunken lane is about halfway between the British trenches and the German trenches, in this literally a sunken lane that extends maybe a couple of 100 yards in no man's land. And they're going to use that as their jumping off point. Sadly, there's a low wire entanglement in a piece of low ground just beyond, and they get caught up in that, and their attack is not successful. I digress. The point that Andy was making in this documentary is that in watching the advance, because what Mallins does, Mallins, I think it's Mallins. I might be getting his pronunciation of his name wrong, but he's the fellow that's famous for taking these movies with this camera that's in a big wooden box, and he's one of these giant jobs with his hand crank. He films goes out, films the Lancashire Fusiliers in the sunken lane, crawls back through the tunnel with his camera, and then sets it up because he wants to photograph the mine going off, because he's got the time that it's going to happen. And he's rolling and rolling and rolling, and all of a sudden it goes off. And then essentially, I think he changes the film in it and then swings the camera on the same point, but just swings it, pivots it on the tripod, sets up and films British troops advancing to the crater from just like maybe a 90-degree change in angle. And he's watching them, and you can see them expose themselves on a bit of a forward slope as they're running, which is important to understand. And two, they're moving in single file. They're sneaking through, trying to get up. It's not a big wave of people that come across the high ground kind of thing. And they're talking specifically about identifying that you can see a couple of people fall. And there's like, well, they must be getting hit right now. Like, he's filming British troops in action being hit. And when that footage gets cut for the movie that's shown in theaters in England or in Great Britain and subsequently around the world as a quasi propaganda piece about the Battle of the Somme, they cut that part out. So when you watch the film, it shows, you can see them advancing down the ground, and then it cuts, and there's a group of them that are well advanced in that position because they cut it so you couldn't see them falling. But a couple of the salient points he talks about here is the fact that they're in single file, they're running, and there's not huge masses of them. There's not like 100 guys packed in this one little area. They're spaced out, they're moving quickly, and they're moving in a formation that you perhaps wouldn't expect them to be. And they're trying to use the ground to the best advantage they can. And admittedly, it is a bit of a long, narrow kind of fold in the ground to get up onto the spur where the explosion takes place. But I thought it was important to talk about that to temper the idea of the perpetual waves lapping against German defenses. And that very much is sort of maybe the popular conception. Mm-hmm. But when we look at actual evidence from the day, we can see that that's not necessarily the case. I just thought it was important to talk about that.
No, I think you're right. I think maybe I misspoke. More when I was thinking it was just the constant application of some form of pressure, not letting your enemy relent always. So I guess that's sort of what I was more thinking of, was not necessarily the autonomous, the waves keep coming, but what I was trying to infer there was that the ocean is applying pressure to the coastline at all times. Now that's autonomous, that's gravity. Those are things we can't really like minutia out. That just is what it is. But that's what I was, when you were explaining how that was working, I was like, that, like, I'm always looking for a moment to breathe, right? And like, where is the moment to breathe in what you were describing? And there really isn't one. Doesn't matter how it's coming. It's just, there's a constant application of pressure in the way that these attacks were designed. You might only be getting a platoon, but there's another one behind that, and they have objectives and they have goals, and they might not even be identical goals, or they could be very close, but there's just, what's going on? Where can I breathe? Like, that's sort of what I was imagining when you were speaking. Good clarification, and definitely important to do, because I think there is a consensus out there that the British were, I think that's kind of the lions led by donkeys. The British were just sending waves of men over and over and over the top and into
the same machine gun
fire,
and like the same heavy artillery.
Yeah. So one, that's not what I was implying. I meant more just the constant pressure application. But it did lead to a good conversation, because I definitely have noticed the Hawthorne Ridge clip. I've asked the question, what's with the herky jerky? Did this guy just decide to edit this point? And the first time I talked about it was with a guy that's sort of like a mentor for me, a guy named Jim Maddy. And he was like, oh, that's a famous clip. What they cut out was the Brits dying right there. And I was like, what? And he's like, yeah. He's like, no, because I asked, how many live shots? One of my first questions about the First World War years back was, do we have any combat footage? Because, this technology existed. And, I tried to imagine, in a scenario where the air has been described as solid, are people sticking their cameras up their heads? Like, are they trying to film this stuff? And the answer is mostly no, but there is moments where they capture the actual action on, what do they say? The pictures, right? Not just like a still shot, but in live motion. And this was one of the famous ones. I learned just now, I didn't realize that that's the same shot as the Hawthorne mine explosion. So if they can find that exact moment, all they have to do is just turn the camera on the mount, and you can see two very famous First World War images, I guess. That's cool. I love that.
Yeah.
Go stand in the spot.
I guess the story goes is that obviously having to expose this considerable amount of camera above the parapet, it's not like he's standing behind it, he sort of sights it and he's like he's hiding down just barely, so with his hand up to try and cranking the camera around. So it was really interesting talking to Andy about that specifically on the very ground that we're talking about. And because he's done so much work and effort into researching this, and I'm sure if you saw him on a YouTube clip or something, you'd recognize him. English guy.
We know Andy
yeah.
Robertshaw. We're very familiar. That's why we're a little starstruck that you got to chat with him about this on the grounds. That's pretty cool.
It was incredible. And I mean, as you say, self-professed, the Somme is his self-professed sort of main effort as far as research goes, his main interest. He really ties into the whole social history of the Somme too, and its importance in the cultural fabric of Great Britain and the UK in general. But to go through some of those aspects of what he had presented in documentaries and be able to talk to him face to face on the ground, he's like, yeah, see that rock over there? Just a bit to the left. That's where the camera was. Wow. Right. And right there. And then that's the hill that you see them running across right there. And then if you look over here, you can see the angle and where he's looking. There's the mine crater. You can see the woods that are around it in the modern era, but that's the crater. Now there's two there because they blew one later, but the initial one, that's where it happened. And so you can see that he filmed it this way, and then he just pivoted the camera and he filmed them advancing up to the crater. So as you say, that's something that I really identify historically wise with that kind of detail, that kind of research. And it was definitely one of those kind of once in a lifetime opportunities to be able to talk to the individual about something that he's so passionate about and has done so much research and found out this information about. It was really a cool moment for me.
That's how I feel every time I go to Antietam National Battlefield with this guy right here. This guy's a guide there. It's his bread and butter, his storytelling.
That's I wish that we visited there in what 20. It's been a while now. 16, 17 maybe. Anyway, and it was the only two American Civil War battlefields I visited are Gettysburg and Antietam. We did them on the same trip, and it was something that I really appreciate the amount of effort that the people there and interest and passion they had for the presentations that they were making, the questions that I posed, the answers they gave me. Like there was a real kind of kindred spirit to some of the conversations that I had.
Oh, absolutely.
And then just the maintenance of the battlefield proper, in terms of the fact that they haven't, in maybe in other areas, I think Fredericksburg is one where they've built up around it, or you can't really see the battlefield anymore.
I mean, even Gettysburg is that,
but I mean, those places, and Gettysburg, it like you're looking at almost what it looked like on the day. And again, on the Somme, it's a very similar kind of experience because, are the villages a little bit bigger now? Is there more houses within the village? Perhaps. Sure. But the lie of the land, the general farming aspect, there's just fields everywhere. The town of Albert is going to be bigger than it was back then, right? But Courcelette Village is not that much bigger than it was back then. So being on the Somme, you do have that real kind of, obviously there might be a different, the roads look a bit better. They're not paved with cobblestones anymore.
I'm not getting shelled.
But the road network is all there. You can look at trench maps from 1916 and you can navigate around the Somme today with a trench map from 1916 because the roads are there.
That's what Jonathan Bracken was on our show at the end of last season. Jonathan Bracken is a researcher and historian of the 151st Regiment of the French Infantry, and he said very, very similar to you that he has walked around Zone Rouge with period maps and can find his way basically like it's right now. He said that, there is so much has changed with the obvious century that's passed, but so little has changed that these roads are still in the same place. These woods, I think it was you that said a lot of these woods still occupy the same plots of land or the same, I guess, footage maybe that they occupied 100 years ago. So that's wild to me because a little more, I guess, Gettysburg is definitely a lot more built up than people realized. Antietam is actually remarkably well preserved. And one of the things I was going to relate to with, you sort of getting to stand on the grounds is we have, some very famous photographs of the Civil War, unfortunately, mostly of the dead. But this one particular photograph of the dead at Antietam with the Dunkard Church in the background is a very iconic image of the American Civil War. And I've been fortunate enough with Matt in person and on my own to stand roughly in the spot where Alexander Gardner took that photograph. And I've been able to hold a copy of that photograph and holy crap, I'm right here. Yep. It's
there.
When you get those moments, whether you're getting it firsthand or secondhand through us talking about some of our shared experiences, this is why we do what we do, because you get this feeling, you connect with it for a moment and you feel all the feelings. Because as I stood there observing this moment of the Dunkard Church, and I was like, wow, I found it. And then instantly I was like, wow, this is a place of horror and sadness. And I was excited for a half a minute. And maybe I tempered that. I shouldn't be. Maybe I should have a little more reverence for this, but it's like a series of emotions. We did this with Bob Ballard and Titanic. The moment they find Titanic, there's pandemonium on the ship. And then he's like, wait, we should maybe have a little bit more reverence for this because a lot of people died here on this ship. And so like, this is the connection to history. It's a roller coaster of emotion. Mm-hmm. I'm in a glass case of emotion. Moving us along here, Rob. We don't want to, because I am the great derailer. This is like my nickname that I've just taken upon over the last season and a half. Moving the campaign, because obviously we could probably talk about this campaign for hours, getting stuck on each one of the single actions you laid out a little bit ago. So what I want to do is focus on a couple of them, maybe in a little bit of a detail, but maybe not every bullet that was fired during these moments. But I want to talk about some Canadians during the Battle of the Somme, the campaign of the Somme. I know that there's a lot of Canadians engaged at Flers-Courcelette. I first learned that because a branch off of the historical research I'm doing with Herbert Johnson of the 85th Battalion. He has a cousin, James Woods. I forget the unit he's with, but he's killed and he's on the roll for killed in action at Courcelette. And I was like, what's that? Well, it was a place where a lot of Canadians were involved, things like that. So other than that, is there a battle along that list that you want to focus on, or do you want to jump right to September of 1916?
What we talked about earlier, specifically with Thiepval, has a interesting, and that's why we were talking about that hinge of a swinging door that the sort of front line evolves into, and that plays into where the Canadians end up fighting on the Somme because of the nature of the ground. Obviously, the ground always dictates is the primary tenet of any military operation. So I think that's a valuable segue into discussion of the Canadian activity and involvement on the Somme. There's a few things that perhaps we can say, sort of take a quick step back and preface that discussion with. In that the Canadian Expeditionary Force is formed in 1914, and it is, I think we talked a little bit about it in the first episode, essentially is a brand new army, much like the new army is formed in Great Britain. The Canadian Expeditionary Force is a brand new army formed with drafts taken from the existing Canadian militia, which is the term used for the Canadian Army, which is almost entirely part-time.
Right.
We have, at the time, there's one regular infantry regiment with one battalion in Canada. The rest of the army is made up of militia soldiers. And the militia is not maybe it's got a different connotation to that maybe in the United States. So maybe that's important for your listeners there to understand that a militia may have some connotations of more of a grassroots kind of organization. But in Canada, the name of the army is termed the militia.
That is
so non-permanent active militia is an older term that's often used. So just so when I'm saying that word, it's important to put it in the right context. And the first grouping of that forms the Canadian Expeditionary Force, which is got a strength of one division, one infantry division based on the usual British Empire model. So there's 12 battalions of infantry. They're all numbered, with some exceptions later on with different raising of different divisions. But the first division comes to France in February of 1915, and then has its first real action at Second Ypres, with coinciding with the first gas attack of the Germans.
Right.
After that, they remained in the Ypres salient in varying locations, and are gradually, as 1915 goes on, joined by the Second Division. And as Canada's army is building, as every army, as we're well aware, is building through 1915, Second Canadian Division is raised. And by September of 1915, it takes the field, and the Canadian Corps is established as a headquarters, as an entity. And so we see the start at that point of the existence of what remains for the rest of the war as the Canadian Corps, a corps being a group of divisions. What's peculiar about the Canadian Corps, and indeed the Anzac later on, is that the Canadian Corps remains homogeneous. It remains with its Canadian divisions, sometimes with attachments from attachments of British divisions. But what happens is the Canadian divisions are never used outside of the Canadian Corps in other corps around the BEF. And that's peculiar to Canada and Australia and New Zealand, who operate under the Anzac umbrella.
Right.
Because British corps, British divisions are plug and played as they're required. They're mixed up all over the place. But it becomes a salient feature of the Dominion's troops is that they remain as a grouping that's homogeneous.
Have you found it's
so that's
easier
September
to research
1915. Them? I'm sorry?
Have you found that makes it easier to research them because they're not being shifted around as much?
What tends to happen is it's the history of the Canadians in the Great War, like the Nicholson official history. Mm-hmm. It certainly makes it easier to coalesce all the information because the Canadian Corps, once it comes into existence, every other Canadian troops, with the exception being of some of the cavalry, that's the one, with the exception of the cavalry who operate in British cavalry divisions as the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, but as the divisions are raised, brought to France, they're incorporated into the Canadian Corps. They're not sent off to another corps to operate somewhere. They come into the fold. So it's this constant, it gets to the point of having 4 infantry divisions in it, plus the corps troops, and et cetera. And then it remains as that. And divisions aren't plucked away from it and new ones brought in. I would say that, it's hard to research the history of like 10 Corps because 10 Corps at the first day of the Somme had 3 divisions in it, but later on 10 Corps had 5 divisions in it, who were all different.
Wow.
Right? Because of the nature of the British way of doing business. So I would say perhaps it's easier to research, and especially when you hold up the one book, there it is, right? That's the Canadian Corps in the Great War. You can't do that with 10 Corps. I don't know if there's a 10 Corps history. There might be. Right?
Rob, this is my shelf of Canada and the Great War right here. This is all my Canadian Great War resources as I write about the 85th Battalion. So I'll take a picture of that. You can tell me if I got any clunkers on there and I need to update or something. The Nicholson book's amazing, so I know that book gets to stay.
The Canadian Corps comes into existence in September of 1915, and thereafter is the home of Canadian forces on the Western Front, with some exception. But generally speaking, the Canadian Corps becomes an entity within the BEF. Mm-hmm. So by the summer of 1916, the 3rd Division arrives. So we've got a corps that numbers 3 divisions now. And the 4th Division is on its way. The units that form the 4th Division have been formed in 1916, and they will end up being on the Western Front just at the end of the Battle of the Somme. So we will, by the end of the Somme fighting, the Canadian Corps will have its 4 divisions in place. All have been in action, had some experience. And at that point, we sort of get to a bit of a stasis point as far as the building of the Corps goes, as numbers specifically. So that's the first part to sort of put in the right context here when we talk of Canada on the Somme. It is, in fact, the Canadian Corps. A lot of people may associate that phraseology and the fact that it's operating as the Canadian Corps with Vimy, because the political sort of attachment and the social, cultural attachment. Vimy, it's like the first time the Canadian Corps went into action, well, with all 4 divisions. Okay, first time it went into action with all 4 divisions at the same time. There was actually 5 divisions in the Canadian Corps, as we talked about, I think, in the last episode.
But that's the reserve. That's the reserve division. Right?
Wow, listen to you, eh?
Yeah, see, I know a little bit. I read the book. I read the Nicholson book. No. But would it be fair? Because we did talk about this, and I was super glad because Matt and I have pretty much brought this up every time we've talked about your episode and my work since we did the first episode with you. I'm like, I wonder how much of my work I need to go back and put a different filter on, because a lot of what I first wrote about in my project was the sort of Canadian exceptionalism of Vimy, and the first time they do all this and the first time Canada that. And as you've, just laid out, succinctly and elaborated on in the first episode, like they're there on the Somme doing all of these things that they do at Vimy. But in 1916, like all 4 of the divisions are there. They are attacking, together more or less as a homogenous unit. I guess maybe my question to you in this moment would be, is it fair to say they have more of the lead with Vimy than they do at the Somme? Like, are they taking more British direction at the Somme, whereas at Vimy they have maybe more of the game plan? Maybe that's what it is.
Well, technically, the direction they get is exactly the same at Vimy as it is in the Somme because the Corps commander is the same. And I don't know if you recall from your reading who the Corps commander of the Canadian Corps is, both on the Somme and at Vimy, but it is Julian Byng.
Right.
Who's British.
Right.
And the Canadian command of the Corps doesn't actually happen until after Vimy, when Currie takes command and becomes the Corps commander.
So that should be the moment that we talk about for Canada, when Currie finally gets in control.
Well, again, I mean, it's a hugely convoluted topic and can have a lot of kind of political bents to it and whatnot. Right. It's something that I like to make sure gets mentioned, especially when we talk about the Somme. The two attacks, Vimy and the fighting at the Somme, are different, very different in terms of character, tactics, nature, experience, innovation. They're all different, but one leads from the other. Vimy is Vimy because of the Somme,
right? Because
of the lessons they've learned. And it's hard to. There's a what's the word or a good way perhaps to describe fighting on the Somme in terms of the character of it, and why at times it seems very non-innovative. Is that movie that came out with about Churchill and the evacuation of Dunkirk? It had the guy who played Churchill was he won an Oscar. It just came out a couple of years ago. Anyway, there's a scene in the movie where he's in the bunker and he's talking. Sorry?
Was it Darkest Hour?
The Darkest Hour. Yeah, that's the one. And he's being confronted by all the rest of the people, the politicians that are having this meeting. And he says the line, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he's like, "You can't negotiate with a tiger when your head is in its mouth."
Right. Speaking
of trying to appease Hitler and should we sue for peace and all that kind of stuff. So there's an aspect of that. It's like when you're in right at the coalface, sometimes it's very difficult, especially when you've got so much tied up in it, and you're attempting to create pressure. Is that it's hard to sort of stop and take stock and change significantly your approach, your way of doing business, because you're in the middle of doing that business all the time. As we've already seen on the Somme, it's one attack after the next, small breaks onto the next push, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes to take the time that needs to innovate with artillery and coordination and tanks and all these things that are attempted on the Somme, you're in the middle of it. And it's, I think that aspect can be paralleled in avenues of civilian life and personal life. When you're in the middle of something, it's very hard to change direction. And you're having success in the right context. I use that phrase, in context, about the Somme. You are gaining ground. It's a mess, regardless of any way you slice it, right from day one. But they're pushing. That's the nature of the fighting on the Somme. Attritional warfare. They're feeding in divisions, and they must maintain this pressure, not only to sustain the battle there, but then also to have the desired effect of relieving the French at Verdun. They have to keep this going, because if they can't just stop like they stopped on day one, they have to go. So I wonder personally is if some of this sort of the friction that was experienced on the Somme in terms of barrages not being perfected and, significant defeats incurring because of that, among other reasons, is this might be some of the reason behind it. Is because this sustained, action over many months it's this boxing match, and you can't, rejig your left jab when you're constantly throwing a left jab. You can't say, "Oh, my elbow needs to be a little bit this way," and to take stock and think about it when you're constantly having to throw it, right? So I wonder if that has some aspect to play with the way that the Somme battle and fighting evolves. But after, there is a break. Over the winter, huge amounts of stock are taken in what happened. We've stopped fighting. The winter's here. Everything's petered out. Everybody's absolutely exhausted. The Germans are on their heels, but we can't sustain this anymore. Now, what? Okay, Jesus, we got to get this sorted out now. Let's take stock of what just happened. What was good things about it? What are things we need to sustain? What are things we need to improve? How do we do this better? What were the glaring errors right from day one to day, whatever the end number of days was? I can't remember, 100 odd days or whatever it was. So with the break over the winter, they have the opportunity to do that. And as a result, into 1917, we have a rejuvenated BEF in the greater context. We have training, we have different ways of different tactics that are being introduced into the infantry. We have bettering of artillery and the technical aspects of artillery fire, the coordination of artillery fire, the types, the construct of barrages. So huge innovation comes out of the Somme. It's paid for in blood, and you can't get over that fact. But to contextualize it is also important, I think. So we're again down a bit of a rabbit hole, a bit of tangent here, but to take it back to Vimy, the Vimy in the Canadian context comes as a direct result of the Somme and the lessons learned by other forces taken in to the greater BEF construct of training and of evolution from the French. The French have a lot to say about what the way to do business, and that is taken in consideration as they move forward into 1917. There's one other thing I want to talk about before we actually launch into the Canadian operations is another thing that, for the channel, British muzzleloaders in particular, has a bit of a pertinent aspect to it is, well, I guess it'd be easier to...
Yes! Show and tell!
And for those that are listening rather than watching, this is in fact a Mark III Ross rifle that has featured on the channel from time to time. So that is the Canadian service rifle going into the Great War. It's the 303 caliber. It fires the same type of ammunition as the rest of the British Empire, 303 British in modern money. But there are significant problems with that rifle, especially as it is produced going into the war. There's quality control issues. There's some design aspects to it that aren't perhaps as appropriate for the type of use and service that it ends up seeing. Mostly it's quality. It's bad metallurgy, bad dimensions, or not say bad, inappropriate dimensions. It's very finely toleranced in the chamber area, and that has aspects and plays a role in stoppages when using British ammunition, which is manufactured to looser tolerances. That, plus or minus 3,000th or plus or minus 1,000th makes a difference, or 5,000ths of an inch when we talk about the shape of the chamber, the length of it, and all that kind of stuff. So these are problems with the Ross rifle that are identified early on. There's a lot of politics behind that rifle, and it hits its first speed bump after Second Ypres in April 1915, when large elements of the 1st Division, that first element of the CEF that goes overseas, essentially says, you know what, this rifle is not performing. We've had all these issues, and just being the nature of the battlefield and the fact that, Canadian units will pass back and forth through British ones, there are surpluses of a lot of things on the battlefield, and when they are able to, they pick up Lee Enfields. So,
yes, mine is currently getting cleaned up. I could have shown one of these too.
I'm now holding up my number one Mark III, in this case, number one Mark III Star, short magazine Lee Enfield. And that's the rifle that replaces the Ross gradually, which is interesting to note. That the 1st Division is essentially, for all intents and purposes, re-equipped by the middle of 1915 with the short magazine Lee Enfield. The 2nd and 3rd Divisions, which have been raised and sent overseas, are re-equipped with the SMLE in August of 1916. So after the beginning of the Somme fighting, But at this time, the Canadian Corps is in positions around Ypres. So they're not involved in the fighting on the Somme at this point. And the 4th Division, which has been the last field element of the Canadian Corps to arrive, they'll be re-equipped in September of 1916 with the Lee Enfield. So by the time Canada fights on the Somme, with some exceptions, snipers and this kind of thing, they are fighting with the SMLE, not with the Ross. But the fighting earlier in June at Mount Sorrel, up in the Ypres sector of the front, that fighting with the appropriate divisions in the line, the Ross would still feature. But by the time the Somme comes around, the Lee Enfield has supplanted the Ross rifle. For all the reasons that even a cursory amount of research will point to directly.
Your Smiley is in impeccable shape, and I am willing to bet yours didn't come from a crate in Ethiopia for 80 years of storage like mine did. I have a buddy of mine working on mine right now. And I was like, man, I'm bummed that I didn't get to like show mine as you were showing yours, but I'm like glad I did, because yours looks like it's incredible shape. And mine's like, I think there's metal somewhere in here. Like it's got shellac and all this other shit all over it. And it's like way beyond my skills of like gun maintenance. So my buddy is like, I'll take it. And he's like, I can't even get the clip out of this thing at the bottom. Like we can't figure it off the air. We'll talk, but like, we can't even get the clip out of this thing right now. So the whole, my gun's in terrible shape.
Well, it's lucky that way. That was the very first military rifle I ever got. And I was, I don't know, 16. So I've had that for quite a while.
You're still a young guy. You haven't had it that
1916 long. Production. It's one of the first, one of the first production Mark III Stars. Mark III Star Lee Enfield was brought into production starting in 1916, using some of the economies. Some of the parts are a bit more simple. Some of the features were left off to make things easier to manufacture during the war. So that's one of the first sort of production Mark III Stars. It just happens to be that way. I didn't buy it that way. I got it from a friend way back when, and that's the way it ended up.
Good friend.
$75, I think I paid for it.
Shut the front door. Shut
Canadian.
the front. Okay. All right.
Which is about what, $35 American?
I was gonna say that's even less. Like, wait, my conversion brain just the wires jammed, but that's even cheaper in our buckaroo.
Like $55.
Jesus Christ. So all right, we're gonna move on because I paid significantly more than that for my beat up 80-year-old, 86-year-old rifle, because I think mine's a pattern. I think mine's a Mark III, but it was made in like 1936. So like there's not too much that's different about the rifle, but it's not Great War era as far as its construction, but we'll get into that a different show. So let's do this. Let's get into the Canadian action.
Yep.
Let's cover that. And then we'll just, when we're wrapping that up, let's take the campaign back to 30,000 feet and we'll kind of wrap it up, which is sort of what the aftermath of this is like. Sort of the effects on Great Britain, the effects on the BEF, including, everything that's involved, the Canadians, Anzacs, whatever you want to talk about. And I always like to leave things open-ended, right? Because the Great War doesn't end when this story ends.
Right.
The work of storytelling never ends. And we'd like to have you back to maybe talk about the Great War again, Canadians and British as well. So we'll let you decide where to specifically end it. But let's get into Canada on the Somme.
Right. As he said, it starts with the actual Dominion forces from a different Dominion is the starting point of Canada on the Somme. We talked a little bit about, you asked the question about how does a battle like this get sustained with, sort of all your eggs in one basket on the first day. It appears that way, but they pick up and they keep fighting and they keep throwing punches in different areas. Never again do they have that top to bottom main effort all at once, but the efforts are contained within smaller sectors of the front now. But it's constant and attacks go in, and then there's a small break and then more fighting. And the nature of the fighting on the Somme is very attritional. It's not, it's a blunt instrument to put sort of a phrase to it that it's like, we need to keep the pressure up. We have these people available. We're sending them in this area to achieve this effect. And a lot of times it's not successful. So in that concept, once those initial efforts are made through the early part of the summer, we see newly arrived from, I guess relatively newly arrived, is the Anzac. The Australians arrive on the Western Front. They're reconstituted, brought back to sort of field strength after their experience at Gallipoli. Mm-hmm. And they go into the line in sort of that second. I don't want to characterize by phase because I'm not going to be completely accurate here, but they come in not at the beginning of the battle, but not at the end. So they sort of come in the center part of the continuum of the fighting on the Somme, and they are focused on a sector of the front that is focused on Pozières, which is the village on the Bapaume Road, and they are committed to action wholesale, and they suffer grievously. I mentioned last time, I believe it was, about this book, The Anzac Experience, by Christopher Pugsley. It goes into great detail about the Anzac experience on the Somme, and as a direct follow-on from what they experienced at Gallipoli. So through a huge sacrifice, a huge amount of effort, and blood is spilt in fighting for essentially Pozières and this center part of the front. The left being near a place called, ends up anyway, being a place called Mouquet Farm, which is down in a bit of a low ground. But we talked earlier about this hinge effect of the front as the southern part of the Somme battlefront gets extended gradually through relatively continuous fighting. And this part of the front represents that first chunk of the door out from the hinge, right? So the Australians push that door further open to it, and that front becomes more east-west. And with that axis of their advance being, as the Australians are pushing up the Bapaume Road, which is sort of runs from southwest to northeast, sort of at an angle. They get to a point where now the Australians, the Anzac, is spent in terms of manpower. They've made their push. They've committed what they are able to commit, and they need to be relieved. And sitting up north is the Canadian Corps, numbering at this point 3 divisions, and have not been committed to the Somme. Much like we talked about Verdun, about how in the French army, almost every division rotated through Verdun, and was sort of the effect of that place was imparted in terms of the cultural aspect. Almost the whole army got rotated through the Verdun. In that same kind of rotation model, the Canadians come to their turn to be committed on the Somme, and they take up the part of the line that the Australians were holding. And this is just past the village of Pozières, which by that point, much like Thiepval earlier on, has been reduced to basically nothing, just a big pile of brick and rubble. But it is sort of a high point on this Bapaume Road. The Pozières has been built on a bit of a high feature, and after that, it kind of plateaus as the Bapaume Road stretches out towards Bapaume. So the Canadian 1st Division sort of occupies the line, and they come into the line on the 30th of August. And the division holds the frontage of the Canadian Corps, which is replacing the Australians. And they spend the next couple of weeks sort of trying to tidy up the line. I say that without trying to be lighthearted about it, but there are elements of that need to be solidified, need to be consolidated. Let's push the Germans back just a little bit, give us a bit of space here so we can dig our trenches and fortify and get sort of set, ready to go for the next bound forward. And after that sort of 2-week period is undertaken, there's an attack made by the Australians on the 3rd of September as sort of their last effort at Mouquet Farm, which is supported by Canadian elements as well. And by that point, or after there, the Australians sort of finally get off the battlefield, and they go into a period of reconstitution. Those 2 weeks occur. The line is then solidified, and they're ready to go for the next push. And this is the battle of, in Canadian context, Courcelette, but in the greater BEF context and fighting on the Somme, it's Flers-Courcelette, because Flers being the little village to the east of Courcelette, essentially. And it's that sector is taken up immediately to the right by the British 50th Division. And the 11th British Division is to the left of the Canadian Corps. The axis of advance that the Canadians are given is essentially along that Bapaume Road, but it's going to curl slightly as time progresses up the road into Courcelette, and then sort of reorient everything, and everything turns north. As we talked about that swinging door, as it you'll be looking at it like this, I guess, right? As it sort of swings up, is that the Australians left it like this. Now the Canadians will push it out a little bit, and then it's going to gradually turn into that, right? With Thiepval being the hinge here, right?
Right.
So the initial attack at Courcelette is 2 divisions. So remember, we talked about the Canadian Corps is now, and has been for quite some time, an entity unto itself, 3 divisions strong. The 1st Division occupied the line, held it, allowing the 2nd and 3rd now to be ready to go and launch fresh into the fight. And they do that on the 15th of September. And importantly, in this attack is, as maybe students of the Great War, or the Somme in particular, the Battle of Flers-Courcelette is the first use of tanks. That the tank has been in development now for quite some time. It's been a secret. And the decision is made to launch the technology into the fight now. And there are there's proponents for it. Ultimately, it is used. But there are also some arguments to say that maybe it shouldn't have been used. Maybe the technology wasn't mature enough. And I think history shows that perhaps it may not have been. But the evolution of the technology, perhaps this is my thought, is that you can hold something and try and perfect it as much as you can, but you may not get to the point that you would otherwise get to, is if you used it, found out its weaknesses, and were able to evolve it, right? If that makes sense.
Absolutely. You got to battle test stuff. That's why they say battle tested.
Right. So there's arguments to and for the use of tanks at Flers and Courcelette. But we're talking about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tanks, if I'm not mistaken, in support of the Canadian Corps. 6.
Rob, were the Germans just like, holy shit, with these things moving across the field at them? Like, right? You say this is the first time. So like for us in the 20th and 21st century now, like tanks are a staple of a battlefield, right? Like everybody's seen in the military circles the clips of the M1A Abrams hauling ass across Iraqi deserts and Kuwaiti deserts, and we've seen, you know, Sherman tanks blowing up things during World War II battles. Like we've seen this now, or getting blown up. And we've all seen the movie Fury with Brad Pitt and Shia LaBeouf. And just for movie reference, the Churchill movie you were talking about, Darkest Hour, was Gary Oldman that played Churchill. Matt,
yes, thank you.
Yeah. Fantastic. Dracula for all you older guys out there. Sirius Black for all you younger Harry Potter fans. Same guy. But anyway, like were the Germans just like, because they'd never seen this before, right? These have never been on a battlefield. Were the Germans just like, what?
Yes and no.
Right.
Okay. The yes piece comes from what they had, the ability that they had to affect the battle locally. There was obviously, they had never been used before. Nobody had ever seen them before, including the Canadians. It wasn't like there was months and months and months to ramp up and train with the tanks and learn how to use them. It was much like we talked about earlier, that kind of, you know, you can't negotiate with the tiger when your head's in its mouth. They're in the middle of a battle with their nose pushed right up against, you know, the coal face. There's no time really in terms of operational tempo to take stock. So when someone comes up from behind and said, hey, we got this thing we've been working at, we've got it to a point where it's going to work. We think like it's good enough. We think we assume that it is. Let's use it here because this is going to make a difference. And okay. It's an interesting point that Haig, the commander of the BEF, who is often, especially in the, I don't want to say traditional, but the more maybe widely understood or viewpoint that, you know, he was a stubborn cavalry officer who didn't, you know, undertake or entertain any kind of innovation, just sent the men to the slaughter. Well, he approved the use of the tank, arguably before it was mature enough to be used, because he was looking for something to do and to get out of this, to make a difference that to what was actually happening on the battlefield at the present time. So again, that's another discussion. The whole Haig thing is a huge other discussion, but that's an example of something that he approved the use of this technology, this brand new thing on the battlefield to hopefully make a difference. And it did make a difference, but that difference was not certainly that breakthrough. The war is going to be won now because we have this new bit of kit that's clanking up the road behind us. From the accounts that I have read, that, you know, when the Germans saw these things clanking down the road or across the field, that they're like, well, what is this thing? And the blue smoke is chugging out from behind it, and the machine guns are firing, and the guns out of the sponsons, you know, and they shoot their rifle at it or the machine guns, and there's nothing happens, right? So there's going to be that initial shock. But remember, these things are moving at like 1 or 2 or 3, 4 miles an hour. Right. They're not, you know, rampaging across the Iraqi desert at 35 miles an hour.
Right. They're not Abrams out there.
They're monsters that are just clanking along. 100% they're not. So that real shock effect is just, you have to contextualize that, because now all of a sudden this thing comes out of the gloom at you and you shoot at it and nothing happens. It keeps coming. Well, it gets close enough now. You're like, oh, Jesus. And now, but you notice behind them, there's big swarms of infantry coming in behind them. And it's not stopping. How do I stop this thing? I can't. I'm either going to die where I am or I'm going to have to move. Right? So that aspect of it, for sure, is going to have a role to play on the success, the local success within the Flers Courcelette context, for sure. I'm just trying to find a quote here. I believe it was next door in the 50th Division. They talk about a tank. I
don't think people understand, just for while you look up this quote, how slow things during the First World War move. Not just the progress of you know, the price of a mile gaining land, but like soldiers could walk in front of the gas. The Canadians, right? One of the things that the Canadians and the French learned in 1915. Unfortunately, with the gas, you know, it's similar to the tanks. It's like kind of like, what are we looking at? It's moving so slow that they're not exactly, should we get out of the way of this? Like it's like jarring how slow the gas moves. The tanks move similarly jarringly slowly. Like you said, you laughed. You think, when we think of tanks, we think of the Abrams hauling ass. But this, like, I am a slow dude and I could outrun this tank. I could probably out speed walk this tank, you know, throwing on my Adele, rolling in the deep, outrunning the tanks. And I just don't think people understand that technologically. While some of these things are brand new, like Matt and I were talking about this recently with planes, right? Like we're going to be doing a special presentation for you by the time you're listening to this in August of 2022, coming up very soon. We're going to take to the skies above the Western Front. But, you know, we think of, you know, fighter planes and Chuck Yeagers and breaking the sound barrier and all this crazy shit. And like, we're talking about World War I biplanes and, you know, triplanes and things like that are flying maybe a little bit over 100 miles an hour, maybe closer to 150, 200, depending on scenario, things like that.
By the end of the war. Yeah.
Yeah. But we're not talking like Mach 3, hair on fire, you know, cruising with, you know, Maverick and Top Gun kind of scenarios. But like, that's, I think, what a lot of people have in their mind, and similar to the ground stuff with tanks. Yes, there are tanks on First World War battlefields. They're very primitive. They are slow. They are huge. They break down. Amiens, I think, is the big famous tank battle of the war. And the majority of those tanks get disabled. Like it's crazy. So we're at the very beginning of even all of that, right? You know, with the application of tanks here. I also am a big fan of Haig. I think Haig has huge brass balls. I think he is a cavalry commander that's sort of stuck in the old ways, but he's not a dummy. He didn't get to his position by being a dummy. So when somebody probably made the right sales pitch with the tanks, he was like, all right, you son of a bitch, I'm in. Let's do it. I'm pro Haig. If you don't like that, don't listen to the show.
I haven't been able to find the exact quote, but I paraphrase, and essentially it was observed that I believe it was in the village next to Courcelette, which is Martin Puig. If that's a name I might be mispronouncing. It was that the quote was as I was watching or looking at the British Army walking behind this tank, and they're all like walking behind it cheering, and it's clanking down the sort of main road because it's that awe factor, that shock factor has enabled them to do that. I think the effect of trying to find that quote is lost a little bit in that paraphrasing, but essentially when you ask, so was this a big deal locally where they were able to influence the action? Yes, it was a big deal because there was no defense against it. But very quickly, a couple of things happen. One, they are very vulnerable to artillery, especially artillery that is able to be placed on them. And later on, specifically during the war, is that there are artillery pieces that are dedicated, not in the context of being an anti-tank gun, but the Germans adapt, because we talked about this in the first episode. This isn't just butting heads. It's a constant one-up job that we have a good attack scheme that works once, and then the Germans learn about it, and they put something in place to check that. And then we try that again, and it doesn't work. And now we've got to innovate again to get one step up. And the same thing happens. And it goes right the way through the war. And you can measure it. So at the initial, outset, the effect of the tank locally within the confines of that immediate action surrounding it has a huge impact. But the other big thing is that we talked about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 tanks that were supporting the Canadian attack at Courcelette. 1, 2, 3 got stuck, and 1 broke down.
Literally just proving my point that it's so primitive. So 6 tanks and 4 of them don't work.
Right. So that's something that you need to temper that effect on the battlefield. That yes, where they were able to get to, and they had an effect in that locality. But as far as the ability to sort of carry the day and unlimited advances because no one can stop them, 100% not the case. Mechanically, they're unsound. It's not a mature technology. The engines are underpowered. The tactics that they've never used them before. They just have to drum up something that they figure is going to work. And literally the tanks leave up the Bapaume Road, and another sort of left flank comes out of Pozières and sort of curves around on the left flank of the Bapaume Road, and they all get stuck. Or 1, 2 of the 3 get stuck. The other one circles back shy of Courcelette. But it allows the Canadian divisions to advance towards Courcelette. I mentioned the 50th Division being on the right of the Canadian Corps at this battle. It's the 15th Scottish Division is immediately right, and the 50th is to the right of them, and all of which are partaking in the action. So that first sort of push takes the Canadians to the first sort of major feature, which is a sugar refinery. And that sugar refinery is on the Bapaume Road, just south of Courcelette village proper. Courcelette village is actually in a bit of low ground off of the Bapaume Road, and it's accessed by a north-south sort of general access road that kind of comes off the Bapaume Road. It's a sunken road, and it kind of snakes its way down through pretty steep embankments and then turns west into the village proper. And then beyond the village, the ground gently rises up to the Anchor Heights and Tiepville Ridge, looking south to north, that is. So that first push takes them to the sugar factory or the sugar refinery. I say refinery, that's just the term I'm familiar with, but a factory, which is interesting because especially in North America, we're really used to, well, I shouldn't say all of North America, but cane sugar is what we're sort of used to in terms of the industrial capacity to produce sugar. Comes from sugarcane, tropical plant, yada, yada, yada. But this sugar refinery is locally here in this part of France, sugar beet is the source of sugar. And so what you find, especially on these old maps, is like sugar refinery. And in looking at old trench maps, I found it's like, oh, look, there's lots of sugar refineries. Well, that's how they got the sugar. They grew sugar beet. And then locally, like you take your grain to the mill to get it ground into flour. Well, you take your beets and they process it into sugar. Mm-hmm. So that's what the sugar refinery is. But there's a significant action occurs there. And that's that first sort of effort to get that far. And when we talk about that far, we're talking about an advance of on the Bapaume Road from the start line to the sugar factory of about just over half a mile.
Nice.
So we're not talking about some sort of massive, mile upon mile advance here. But the tanks allow that kind of, they do have some effect on the battle. And they allow the, in this case, the 2nd Division on the right of the Corps, the 3rd Division being on the left, to advance that first chunk with the 15th Scottish on their right. The next phase of the Courcelette fighting then turns, and the follow-on brigades then take up the advance, and the axis shifts because this takes that the line south of Courcelette, and now they fight into Courcelette and to the west slightly. And famously, the 22nd Battalion, which is just one of the numbered battalions of the CEF in terms of the number. There's 1 and there's 2 and there's 22 and there's 16 and there's 72 and there's 85.
85.
The 22nd, yeah, there you go. The 22nd Battalion is peculiar within the CEF because it is, and maybe you can guess.
I was, Matt tapped me and I didn't catch the whole question. Not going to lie.
That's okay. The question was peculiar to something peculiar about the 22nd Battalion within the CEF was the fact that the 22nd Battalion was French.
What?
It was a French Canadian battalion. They're from Quebec.
Okay. Right? See, I didn't know that. See, much to study.
Yeah. So the 22nd Battalion is the French speaking, and I would say French from Quebec, is specifically French speaking. So the language used within the battalion is French amongst the troops, amongst the junior officers, the companies and whatnot. Obviously, the staff need to be able to communicate within the Corps context and the division context, so they need to speak English. But the troops are French-speaking, native French-speaking soldiers from Quebec in Canada. The number of their battalion became their moniker. And after the war, it's decided that this battalion will be turned into a regiment of the army proper after the war. And they don't give them a name like the Quebec Regiment or something. They take the nickname that is given to the 22nd Battalion based on an anglicized version of the number in French, which is 22. In English, that gets turned into Vandu, like VANDOO.
Yeah.
And so today, that regiment in the Canadian Army is a regular Army regiment, and it's called the Royal 22nd Regiment. And it traces its lineage directly back to the 22nd Battalion of the CEF, which was raised as a French-speaking battalion within the construct of the CEF. Its nickname in the greater context of the world, and to generally speaking in Canada in particular, is the Vandus, like VANDOOS, like plural.
As you were talking, I remembered that I actually knew that this was a French-speaking unit. I just turned to Matt and said, the Vandus. I remembered this as you were talking.
Now, Rob, is the 22nd battalion ever utilized to help communicate with other Allied forces, like putting them at the ass end of the line? So, hey, you can talk to the French troops that are over there and we can all kind of coordinate as we're advancing.
No, any kind of use of their native, like speaking French, that in that aspect is something that's coincidental with where they are.
Gotcha. I was just curious.
Can they communicate better with the French locals? Sure. Can they communicate better with French troops? But, in this case, they're the right-hand battalion of this second wave of the fighting at Courcelette, and beside them is the 15th Scottish Division.
Right.
So those are guys from all over Scotland.
So nobody understands what anybody is saying on that part of the battle.
It's the Scots and the French.
Yeah, it is just a shit show of accents. We have no idea what's going on. What you were saying though, kind of again to connect it to our wheelhouse, our listeners, to kind of just always show that, history is just a series of replicating things. During the Civil War, one of the famous examples of a cultural language barrier would be the fact that we study Franz Siegel's guys. They go to fight Mitz Siegel. He's got German-speaking guys that basically only speak German or mostly speak German, but he's in command. He speaks English, things like that. But just notable, just to show you that it's not just isolated to things like this. During the Civil War, there are regiments made up of basically German speakers and other ethnicities, things like that. So cool point to bring up there. The Van Dews.
Yeah, the Van Dews, which again is that's the nickname of the unit, because based on the anglicized version of its name, right? Van Dew being Van de, it's the same word, but as somebody who, especially back then, maybe not have any idea of how to speak French properly, not that I do, but Van de sounds like Van Dew. Just like wipers sounds like eep or what have you, right? Interestingly enough, in the United States, there's a group of French-speaking people in the South, and they're called what?
Creole or Cajuns.
Yep. Do you know where Cajun? This is total Canada trivia here. Just there's a quick little sidebar.
Do it.
Cajun is a word that has come from an anglicized version of another word, and that is Acadian.
Yes, I did know that.
And Acadians come from Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. French-speaking people, and they were moved out of New Brunswick and sent to the only part of North America that at the time was still French.
Cool nugget.
The people there could either not pronounce or didn't want to bother pronouncing Acadians and shortened it to Cajun.
Good old Creole.
So that's where Cajun comes from, the word. Cajun. Anyway, that's a total sidebar that's completely unrelated with fighting on the Somme. But the fighting on the Somme, in terms of the Canadian experience, essentially on the 15th September, we have a gain of over a mile, I guess, from beginning to end, in terms of that attack up the Bapaume Road, and then it curves north and takes the village of Courcelette. Fighting in Courcelette is like savage. The village has been destroyed, but all kinds of ways to defend it. Trenches, interconnecting bunkers. The same thing we talked about Thiepval being very strong, partly because of the fact that it is been destroyed on top of itself. But the division is successful in capturing the village proper. There's an anecdote about that sunken lane coming into it was just packed and full of bodies. So incredibly savage fighting around Courcelette. First at the sugar refinery, then as the next wave goes forward, I say wave just as a colloquialism, the next elements push through and on into Courcelette. And that really defines, in terms of the Canadian involvement on the Somme, this shifted axis from up the Bapaume Road to a north-south kind of orientation. Interestingly enough, next to the there's the 22nd and then the 25th Battalion, and then next to them, sort of in the middle of this attack, just to the west of Courcelette, is a regiment of the Canadian Army that I think deserves a little bit of mention here, because it has joined the Canadian Corps late, and its name is the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry. And it hasn't been, although it was raised right off the bat from scratch in 1914, almost constituted overnight, and full of trained ex-army people from Great Britain and from Canada. So it sort of got it off to a very good start that way. But it's the first Canadian unit that is committed to Europe, and it's committed independently to France. And again, the number of the division that it gets attached to escapes me right now. But it serves in a British division and comes to the Canadian Corps late after the fact. It's a privately raised regiment. Hamilton Gault, who's a businessman from Montreal, if I'm not mistaken, is essentially spends his personal fortune in kitting, arming, and raising this regiment, this battalion, for service in France, and does so. It's accepted, and it goes overseas independent of the CEF. But as a Canadian unit, it eventually comes back into the fold and is part of the Canadian Corps at the Somme and the Battle of Courcelette. So I just thought it's a little sidebar there, make sure that gets mentioned. So that's the 15th of September. For a one-day effort, that's quite considerable in terms of that amount of ground captured. Again, everything's in the right context.
Right.
But that's not the end of it, right? It's not the end of it. The involvement of the tanks has made a difference, but it has not made all the difference. And much like we talk about the Greater Battle of the Somme having a whole bunch of actions, Flers-Courcelette being one of them, fighting in particular involving Canada, has a similar nature. Courcelette is not a one. It as itself as a standalone action is by itself, but the sector that the Canadian Corps occupies of the front and their position in the line continues on into November. So what we see with the Canadian Corps is its commitment on the Somme in a series of actions, all generally in the same area, starting with the Battle of Courcelette. After the town is taken in the next couple of days, the 20th and the 22nd of September, that sort of consolidation of the position around Courcelette happens. So there's local attacks pushing the Germans back a little bit off a knoll or just out of reach, trying to just sort of make the position that has been captured that much more defensible and firm. And the attacks extend out east of Courcelette, trying to push the line out. But they're quite local. They're not massive efforts with, like dozens of battalions involved and that kind of thing. Brigade actions, battalion actions, straightening out bends in the line, that kind of thing. Digging new trenches, pushing the Germans back so we can, lay some wire, dig some trenches, get ourselves in a defensible location that we can launch the next one from. So as I say, that goes into a sort of that midpoint of September, the 20th and the 22nd, and puts the army at large in a position to then fight. And we draw all the way back to the beginning of our conversation with that high ground that extends for Thiepval at the end, south of the River Ancre, that sort of extends east-west. Now the army's in a position where that door hinged at Thiepval has almost come east-west. And now we can get units lined up beneath that line and attack north to capture the heights behind Thiepval. This is known as the Battle of Thiepval Ridge, and it's begins on the 26th of September. So we started on the 15th with the Battle of Courcelette, and then some consolidating actions on the 20th and the 22nd. So there's a bit, there's days in between these, but in the greater context of operational tempo, these things are happening very quickly. You got to get the troops that were, you got to get them out of the line. You have to have them relieved in place by new troops, get them oriented to what they need to do, make sure they understand their part of the ground they have to attack. And then guess what? Tomorrow morning you're going, or tomorrow afternoon you're going. Okay. Have we had 3 weeks to organize our barrage and get everything ranged? Nope. You're going tomorrow because we need to keep that pressure up.
Right. So
this becomes the nature of the fighting all across the Somme, but as we're talking about the Canadian sort of area of operations here, very, very a significant aspect of it is this repeated, fairly high tempo style of operations. And as time moves on, we had fighting at Courcelette with tanks involved a complex operation that is initially quite successful. And then we need to keep that up, and we don't have the time to re-coordinate things. Barrage artillery coordination suffers horrendously throughout this period of the fighting in the Somme, just for lack of time, really. Is that organizing it properly? Is the wire cut? No, the wire's not cut. But we haven't even allotted time in order to achieve that or check that it's done. We have to attack. There's pressure being put on everybody, not just the Canadians, but everybody involved in fighting in the entire area to keep the pressure up on the Germans. And this attritional nature of the warfare. And it's horrible trying to downplay it, I think, because it is horrible. I mean, the numbers of casualties are horrendous. When you stand at Mouquet Farm, you can look up to Pozières, and it's basically a big triangle of ground that the Australians fought over. And the number is like 20,000 men became casualties. And you can see this footprint in this little area of field. I mean, it's astounding. And it's in that sense, you can't hide the sadness that accompanies that. That's the nature of warfare at the time. And just, it doesn't excuse it, but it's important to keep things in context, I think, anyway. So Tiepville Ridge, the action there is the Corps is an action from Courcelette extending to the west, and the 11th British Division and the 18th British Division further to the west. And this initial action on the 26th finally sees, because they've captured some of this, or are fighting south to north now, they are finally able to capture Tiepville. So from the 1st of July to the 26th of September, they're finally in a position where they have gained enough ground that they can then take this village that they were trying to take on the 1st, because of the nature of swinging that door all the way around and then attacking from the south.
So that's 3 months, basically. That's all of July. That is all of August. And that is literally almost all of September. Mm-hmm. It took them to accomplish this one goal amongst many, but 3 months, 90 days roughly to get this one.
Yeah. So there is a bit of a caveat there. They weren't fighting at Tiepville for 3 months.
True.
Right?
Sure.
They weren't fighting at Tiepville. They were fighting elsewhere so that they could bring and make it more advantageous to compromise that ground and then launch an attack.
Right.
So that's the piece to it, is to say that it took 3 months to take Tiepville. Yes, but they weren't trying for 3 months. They tried on the first day, and then they didn't try until they were able to commit and do it on the 26th of September. So that 3 months was not spent fighting at Tiepville for Tiepville. It was spent fighting at Courcelette and at Fleur and down by Mametz and coming up from the south there, right? To create that door swinging effect, to get up to the heights behind Tiepville. That action carries on to the 28th and 29th with that same kind of sort of consolidating operations, not so much fully coordinated, but consolidating various parts of the line. It's all in the same general area. And what we see here is, once that initial attack in Tiepville is now taken, is for the most part, it's not. It's still threatened. Obviously, they've just sort of taken the confines of that piece of ground. It's not like the Germans are now 3 miles away. They're still right there. But that actual footprint of the village has now been taken, and that part of the lay of the land. What is looming in the distance, however, for the Canadians here, as once they've sort of pushed out from Courcelette, is a trench that was running along the Tiepville Ridge from essentially Courcelette all the way to in behind Tiepville, is what becomes known as Regina Trench. And it's this huge, long trench. It's described as the longest single trench on the entire Western Front. Now,
wow.
In a bit of context, is there a trench that you could walk below ground from the Channel to Switzerland? I guess if you probably could. So does that constitute one trench? No, it doesn't. Trenches are typically in chunks, and they're given names, and then it turns a corner and it becomes something different, or intersects with another one, etc. Anyway, that's the way it's sometimes described in textbooks. But it's hugely long, and it extends out perpendicular to the old line. But now, because that door has swung and the front has been pushed in the south to reflect that sort of east-west orientation of the line, now Regina Trench is parallel, and the Canadian Corps finds itself basically lined up facing Regina Trench, facing north, up to the Tiepville Ridge and what becomes the Anchor Heights. So once this initial sort of September fighting happens, then the task is given to the Canadian Corps to attack Regina Trench. And to me, it's one of those things that it almost, how do I put this? It doesn't exemplify the fighting on the Somme. In some ways it does, because it's hugely attritional and it's met with repeated attempts, repeated setbacks. I mean, it's hard to imagine, given sort of the research I've done, the people that I've talked to about it, the kind of it's very depressing that there's no time for coordination. There's no attempt made to really sort of stop and go. And I think because of what we talked about earlier, this kind of we're right at it. We can't stop. We have to keep going. And in order to keep going, we have to attack like in 3 days. We can't wait 3 weeks because the Germans will get sort of settled. We can't let them get settled. And what ends up happening is here at the Anchor Heights, which is just a different part of the battlefield further north. And it's just the high ground extending from Tiepville that as the Anchor River turns east-west, south of which is this large piece of high ground that the Canadian Corps in part fights for. But, their task is to take a trench. It's to take a ditch in the ground. It's not to take, a part of a feature or something along those lines. The feature is dominated by Regina Trench. So I guess in some senses that, yes, to take the trench would then give you domination of that ground. But October is sort of marked by this constant attack and setback. The 1st of October, the 2nd Division goes into action. There's just let me check here. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, sort of a 10 or a dozen battalions of the Canadian Corps involved in that initial effort. There's another, most of which are completely unsuccessful. They get to the trench, have to be turned around and get stuck in wire, this kind of thing. The next effort happens on the 8th of October, fighting for the same trench. This one has a particular anecdote to play is the specific event that happens regarding a member of the 16th Battalion, which become known as the Canadian Scottish, which were a battalion that was formed from 4 different militia regiments way back in 1914, part of the 1st Division. They go into action here during the Battle of the Anchor Heights, attacking Regina Trench. And it being a Scottish battalion, it has pipers. And one of the pipers of that battalion, the last name is Richardson, James Richardson. And he's from Western Canada in British Columbia. And it was a member pre-war of the local militia regiment, the 72nd Seaforth Highlanders. But when that draft went to Valcartier way back in 14, it wasn't a full battalion strength. So it got amalgamated and part of the 16th Battalion. So he ends up in the 16th Battalion as a piper. And he's, the battalion gets hung up on the wire and is stalled. And the famous line is, "Shall I give wind?" Means, shall I give my pipes air and play? Is what he asks. Shall I play my pipes? And he gets told, yeah, play your pipes. So he cranks his pipes up and he starts marching back and forth, playing his pipes in full view of the enemy. And sort of, he doesn't ensure success of the attack, but it's a moment where he identified as somebody who is turning a route, or what possibly could be a route, into something that is a bit more measured. The battalion is unable to get into the trench and keep it and get through the wire and everything. But this singular moment of James Richardson playing his pipes at the wire in full face of the Germans is something certainly of note. And what happens is, as the battalion kind of works its way back after this failed attempt at getting to Regina Trench, is James Richardson is involved in stretcher bearing. And in the process of stretcher bearing, carries casualties back and realizes that he's left his pipes up somewhere towards the trench out in no man's land, and basically takes off to go get them. And essentially is never seen again.
Oh, wow.
I was literally getting ready to ask, does our man with the biggest stones to ever live survive the war? And the answer, unfortunately, is likely no. That stinks. Because I was like, I made the joke about Haig earlier having some big brass ones, but playing your pipes in the face of the enemy on the Western Front, that kind of gives you the win. You got the biggest stones ever. Period. Fact.
And he's 20 years old.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not cool. No, I'm 35 and just not cool. I'm just gonna flatly state that for the record. I've got a great wife. I've raised a great daughter. That's the coolest things I've ever done. They're amazing, but man, 20 years old playing your pipes on that battlefield.
Yeah,
my mind. The pipes are eventually found, and he is found, obviously killed in action. And he's buried on the Somme in Adnak Cemetery, which is a cemetery, a battlefield cemetery, of which people were concentrated, but it's just a little bit north of where he fell. And as you say, Adnak is a peculiar Canadian word, as a matter of fact, which is seen a lot on street names and stuff around Canada, but has no other meaning other than Canada spelt backwards.
Huh.
So it's just a snippet, a vignette of something that happens during this phase of the fighting in the Somme and pertains to the Canadian Corps, in this case, the 1st Division and the 16th Battalion, and wins Victoria, is awarded the Victoria Cross for his efforts, which is presented obviously posthumously. So this fighting at Regina Trench occupies huge amounts of effort, and the loss sustained by the battalions as they go in with essentially no result it's one of those things, like, if there's lessons to be learned here, they're learning them right now at the expense, unfortunately, of the men that are executing the plan.
More lives, yeah.
But it's hugely attritional. The same reasons that the Australians, were able to go as far as they did, but they couldn't go farther, is because they were worn out. And what we're seeing is the wearing out of the Canadian Corps at this point in time. But the Battle of the Anchor Heights continues on. Regina Trench eventually is captured. And the beginning of November, there's an attack that goes in on the 11th of November, which kind of is interesting in terms of just a standalone date. 2 years to the day, of course, the war is the armistice is declared. Yeah. That's 2 hours, 2 more years of this. But by that point, essentially, Regina Trench is consolidated, and there's a second trench that's dug behind that called Desire Trench. I mean, we're getting to the point where there's no imagination in terms of what we're doing here. We're just taking more German positions. Yeah. Right. In an effort to secure the Anchor Heights. And Desire Trench, which is, again, parallel to Regina, but farther north up on the heights as they go, is eventually captured by the 18th of November. Mm. And shortly thereafter, essentially the battle grinds to its inevitable conclusion, and everybody is exhausted. Everyone has been worn out, both materially, morally, physically. That the Somme has ground. I don't use these terms lightly. It's a very sensational kind of way to present it. But these divisions, these battalions that have gone into the line, have tried to do what is the task they've been given, and they've seen large numbers of casualties to be withdrawn or replaced by new fresher battalions, or battalions that haven't incurred as many casualties. And the attempts are being made to capture these features, these defensive works, and over time they're able to. But that overall concept of at the beginning, the breakthrough, the capture of all three German lines, it's taken, 5 months of fighting here almost. Right. And we're just getting snippets of sort of the third German trench system that in those months, as the Germans see where the advances are happening, they just start digging more trenches, right? And erecting more wire. So it's not something that you can stampede over in a day or a week. And the Germans, the nature of the months of fighting and the relatively, the amount of progress that gets made is that there's time to build in depth more positions, right? So that what we see at the Anchor Heights is that, first there's as a major work, the Regina Trench, and then Desire Trench is behind that. And then there's another one that is dug behind that. Grand Corps, where does it end? As far as this action goes, you have to fight all the way up over the Anchor Heights and down to the river. So a couple of things are happening here. One is the physical exhaustion of all the troops involved, the material exhaustion of the army in terms of the stockpiles of ammunition, material, like this, fighting costs material. Like rifles get smashed, they get lost, artillery pieces get blown up, they wear out, horses die, we don't have enough horses to move guns. Like all this stuff happens as part of the nature of the fighting. And eventually that combined with the weather, which has turned horrible well beyond or well before the end of November. We're talking about bad weather in September and October, sleet and rain and mud. And that part of it, certainly, especially fighting on the Anchor Heights here, is significant. That stereotypical, mud hole that you're fighting over. These areas have been shelled so much. The weather's so poor that we do see the development of this stereotype World War I battlefield here. We talked about this on the first episode. When it started, it was nothing of the kind. It was green fields and birds.
It was the green fields of France.
Still growing in the field.
Yeah, it was the Willie McBride song.
Yetville, Pozières, Courcelette, all these places have been smashed, and the ground in between them has been smashed because that's where the trenches were. They've had to try and obliterate the trenches with the guns. The wire's been erected. The wire's been blown up. 5 months of fighting, shelling almost consistently at some point on the battlefield. The ground is going to turn into this horribly, you can't navigate through it. The road is essentially where you're going to be stuck as far as transport. Even the tanks have issues, right? When they're used, they get stuck and bogged down in shell holes and mud and all that kind of stuff. So there's a number of factors that end this battle, and it's not just running out of effort, running out of manpower, running out of material, but the weather.
Before I turn it over to Matt here, that was the exact point I wanted to make sure that we were mentioning is like, not just the wearing out of, your casualties, physical manpower, not just exhausting your supplies, things like that, but, they are destroying the very objectives they are trying to take. So, they say they are just now catching glimpse of this third German line. Well, the first time they're hopping into these first German lines, second German lines, they're not jumping into pristine trenches being like, we got this immaculate land that was yours. Like they're jumping into absolutely devastated pieces of trench work. They're jumping in, they're coming through villages that they themselves and previously been destroyed and flattened. Like the roads even that they're using, that they are relying on using, have been shelled. There's nothing easy about what these people are experiencing. So like, that's why everything about the conversation of the First World War is, in my mind, relative, like successes on the first day of the Somme, relative, advancing, into first line trenches, second line trenches, 5 months later, we're getting to our third line trenches. Well, those sound like progress, gains, relative. It took us 5 months. It was slow going. What was the cost? Matt and I are big metalheads, a million times during both of these episodes. I've heard Sabaton's Price of a Mile in my head, right, over and over again, things like that. So, but it's relative. And I if you didn't mention it, I was going to mention, like they are jumping, they are moving, they're not jumping. They are moving towards goals and objectives that their artillery has just obliterated. So it's not an easy going, even of their own making. So I'm glad you touched on that, because that's super important. And I think when we come back to 1917 conversations, that becomes especially more prevalent with the advancements of artillery, right? You know, we talk about this. We mentioned Vimy a lot. For context in this episode, well, after Vimy Ridge is taken, when they're trying to move into Lens, you got big problems because you got to rebuild the roads that you just freaking destroyed. Right. So you're seeing elements of that even now here on the Somme, at Courcelette, and on other places, things like that. So Matt, take us away here, bud. You know, we're at the end of this campaign. You know, what are some of your thoughts here?
Right. Rob, we'd already touched on how going into this period of exhaustion and into the winter months, how neither side is, while both are going to be maintaining their positions and their lines, we're also going to go into a rebuilding phase, if you will, particularly for British forces and the Allies in this area. And by 1917, it's going to come back rejuvenated and refreshed and has some new ideas and whatnot. I'm curious, during these months of nominal rest and resupply, relative, exactly. Are we seeing something similar to the Verdun lecture series that the French were putting on? Perhaps something similar for the Somme?
Right. So I'm not particularly familiar with the actual construct of the lectures you speak of, but I do know that there is this period, and we touched on it briefly before. It was just this period of using this cessation of immediate actions going on to take stock and realize and try and digest what has just happened. Not necessarily in a moral sense, but certainly in a operational sense, is what did we do that worked or that we thought was good, and what did not work, and what do we need to change? And this process is definitely undertaken in this period of time. Particularly Currie, as at the time he's the commander of the 1st Canadian Division. He makes trips to visit the French to get some information about what they saw effective tactically, infantry, artillery, the coordination thereof, because it's identified within the BEF context that we need to change something. We need to evolve. That we've just come through this horribly costly battle. We're okay. You know, we're not done. We're still in the field, but there's some significant changes that we need to make. And I'm paraphrasing, two, speaking in very general terms, is that this process is undertaken. There are manuals written, obviously in support of that. There needs to be information found, digested, in some cases translated, and brought into some formulation where we can change the way we do business and then promulgate that out to our guys. Like, don't walk left, always walk right. Right? We always were walking left before, and we tried it, it kind of worked, but now we're going to go right. We have to walk right, but there's a special way to do that. And I'm just obviously paraphrasing here, right? And so we need to find out how to walk right. Then we need to formulate how to train people to walk right. And then we need to actually train them and get that information out to them and let them practice it. And now gradually the army is going to learn how to walk right eventually. And that process starts after the Somme. I mean, to some extent, it's always happening right from the first part of the war, right to the end. That process is occurring. But specifically after the Somme, there is a concerted effort to go and reach out to the French, examine what's going on here. And that leads directly into the actions that take place in 1917. And the first major action in 1917 that the BEF fights is at Ras.
Right, exactly.
Of which Vimy is integral part of that greater battle.
And we're going to definitely come back to Vimy, Arras, Nivelle Offensive in 1917 on the History Podcast in the future, History Things Podcast in the future. My final question for you ties into this sort of wrapping up of things. Are we at a crossroads for the Allied side of the wire as a whole? Maybe just the BEF, where we're realizing if we go one direction and we just continue the way we've been doing this, we're either going to lose the war or we're going to just destroy entirely. It doesn't matter if it's the regular British Army, Kitchener's army, like the reserve, it doesn't matter. Are we just going to destroy the British military structure at this point? Or is the only other option adapt and move this thing forward, with tactics, with technology, with planning, preparation? Because to me, it seems like that's what's taking place here. In a way, the Verdun lectures were kind of like maybe France's version of, all right, we got to do things. We got to take some stock and we got to do things differently, because if we keep doing it like that, there's not a good end game here. Are the British at that crossroads at the end of the Somme where it's like, if we do it this way forever, like we're going to destroy ourselves against the rocks, or adapt and we live maybe?
I in what I've read and whatnot, I don't get the sense that there's this impending doom. That it's been horrible. It's been extremely costly. The army has not crumbled in terms of the BEF, the army in the field. It hasn't crumbled. It's been severely taxed. But the Germans themselves acknowledged the effect that the fighting on the Somme had on them. And there's something to be said for the fact that the victory that is attained in the war starts at the Somme because of the effect it has on the German army. They're not able to mount the same kind of defense, the same kind of tactics. And indeed, they're not able to mount any offensive operations, essentially large-scale ones, until 1918, when they're infused with all the troops coming back from the Eastern Front after the collapse of Russia.
Right.
So it's something that comes up especially in the discussions about the Somme fairly recently. Anyway, as I've picked up on, as I've listened to lectures and read books and stuff like that, is the fact that this was hugely significant to the German army in terms of the cost. That, when we argued numbers and it was 500,000 or 600,000, this, that, and the other thing, is that it significantly affected the way Germany prosecuted the war. That as a result of fighting on the Somme, the decision was made as like, we aren't necessarily going to be able to sustain this again, Verdun and the Somme. So that was integral into the decision to adopt unlimited submarine warfare.
Right.
As a way to fight the war in another way. And which is very effective, is extremely effective, but as I'm sure you're nodding your heads here too, also has a knock-on effect in the sinking of the Lusitania and the ultimate involvement of the United States of America.
Correct.
So, I mean, that's a whole other piece off to itself, but It was just a quote I read in a book that linked the decision to adopt unrestricted submarine warfare and the result of the fighting on the Somme, and it has to be understood Verdun as well, is that although at Verdun it was the Germans attacking generally, and at the Somme it was the Germans defending, it is this significant event in the military history of Germany during that period of time, and it has far-reaching effects, not just immediately on the battlefield. You don't get the sense that the British Army, the BEF, is sort of on a precipice that is going to collapse. It does get not to collapse. It gets dicey. It gets very dodgy and very, very close to something very catastrophic, especially going into 1918, when there is a real and it's interesting sort of sub conversation. The manpower crisis that the British Army faces. They have to reorganize their army because of this. Is Lloyd George holding men in England or in the UK because he doesn't want to give them? Is there some sort of animosity that way because he doesn't want to send them to the front to be quote unquote ground up like they have been for the last year and a half or for the earlier part of the war? That's a discussion unto itself. Suffice it to say, the British Army goes through a bit of a crisis in 1918, and they're barely able to hold on when the Germans attack in March. But they don't break. They do not break. The Germans do not break through. The Germans are not able to achieve what it is they want to achieve, which is ending the war, much like Hitler tried at the Bulge. Right. The March of the Spring offensives in 1918 are the Germans sort of, here we've built this this army up of reinforcements coming from the east. We've retrained a great deal of our infantry in new tactics that'll probably work. Both our defensive structures have changed. The British defensive structures have changed by that point. The concept of area and a different type, moving away from linear defense, like we see at the Somme, trench lines held by individuals and multiple lines thereof. Now we're talking about strong points. We see this in Ypres. When especially when the water table is completely destroyed at Ypres and there's no way you can dig trenches, you need to have bunkers both for shelter and for fighting, and the localities that are then form the basis of the defense and not necessarily connected physically with the locality beside. Maybe by fire you can cover each other, but there's no continuous trench sort of line that you could walk down to the next one. That they're semi-isolated. Both armies had adopt this. Certainly, they have done so by 1918. But the British have this manpower crisis. That comes in 1918. The British Army begins conscription. I'm going to have to look that up in terms of the exact date. I want to say, is it 1916? That the volunteerism that created Kitchener's army, like we talked about in the first episode, that runs its course. And eventually they realized that despite the incredible amount of volunteerism that happened in the early part of the war, and that we see go into action on the Somme in large scale, that has waned, and we are not able to sustain what we need strictly through volunteers. And so the British Army eventually moves to a conscription model, and when your number's up, and you're in the army, and away you go. And that's done for the rest of the war. Canada and Australia, the Dominion forces don't go that far. There is a conscription crisis in Canada, but generally speaking, the Canadian Corps remains volunteer certainly in character, and are able to sustain the numbers in the field, barely, but they do. The British Army, as I say, goes into a reorganization in 1918 in the winter and into the early spring before the March offensives of the Germans. And they basically are forced with taking their 12 battalion divisions and reducing them to 9. That instead of brigades, of which there's 3 in a division, instead of brigades having 4 battalions, let's say 4,000 on paper, now there's only 3. So, this is something that's forced upon them due to circumstances of manpower, full stop. Now, why the manpower? Was it really that bad? That's the discussion about the politics behind it. But in the field, this is what's forced upon them. We have battalions that are 600 men strong that can't sustain action now.
Right. Because,
if they go into action and lose 200 guys, they're physically unusable on the battlefield. We need to have them bigger to absorb the casualties so they can still fight. And in order to do that, they have to break up a quarter of their infantry and redistribute it into the other 3 quarters so that those 3 quarters are at least semi up to strength. So that's about the closest that the British Army, the BEF as a whole, comes to. The Canadian Corps, the Canadian divisions never adopt that model and maintain the traditional, organization. So especially going into 1918, they are corps for corps, division for division, they're stronger in terms of bayonets, in terms of infantry strength. They're percentage-wise 30% bigger than a British division because there's 4 battalions versus 3 in their brigade still. They're more flexible. They can attack with 2 and then lead on with 2. But the British, if they attack with 2, there's only 1 to follow up with. So is a leapfrog advance sustainable in the British context as it is in the Canadian context? Well, it's not. Just math would show you that it's not, right? So there's so many things that factor into that. And I would say, to revisit, is in terms of crisis, in terms of really having to address serious issues, that really only happens in 1918. And to their credit, the Army they hold off the German attacks in the spring of 1918 and basically blunt the German Army to the point where it cannot continue anymore. They pause, and then using the Canadians, the Australians, partly due to the fact that these groupings, these formations are strong, that we have the entire national commitment of manpower goes to 4 divisions in the Canadian Corps, right? So everything coming from Canada, manpower related, is going into the Corps and keeping it as strong as it can be, which is understandably a strength of that Corps. Doesn't mean that the man for man it's necessarily better, but what it means is that as a group, as a unit, as a fighting formation, it's inherently better. It can sustain itself in the field of honor. It can sustain more casualties. And they're used after this pause, after the German attack. And that's what we talked about a little bit earlier about the Battle of Amiens, which is perhaps, it's noted for 2 things. One is the factor of surprise, is that the Canadian Corps in particular is moved from another part of the line up by Vimy, if I'm not mistaken, and they're moved in complete secrecy down to Amiens, and they launch at an attack into the tip of the bulge the Germans have created for themselves. And that begins the 100 Days campaign, which is essentially sees the end of the war.
Right.
So the second piece that Amiens is noted for, apart from surprise, is its use of combined arms. So I think we talked a little bit about earlier the first major tank battle. That was actually in 1917 after Passchendaele.
Cambrai.
Right.
Cambrai. Did I confuse Cambrai with Amiens? My bad. Great war.
Well, Cambrai is the first sort of big mass tank attack, and it suffers from similar problems. It's initially hugely successful. The story goes that that's the first time that church bells are rung in the United Kingdom as a symbol of victory the entire time of the war. The first time, because it's seen as such an incredible feat. They break through the Hindenburg line and play, but then the Germans counterattack because the tactics, the piece to that has not. It's not a complete package, right? They're able to then to fight their way back into the ground that was captured by the British, and the stunning victory ends up not being that way. As a standalone feat and examining the use of the tank, obviously very instrumental. But what we see at Amiens is as close at the beginning of the perfection of that aspect of combined arms. There's planes dropping bombs. There's planes that are strafing in the rear areas. There's all kinds of well-coordinated artillery. There's tanks. There's cavalry. There's all this stuff. The infantry are all tactically adept. The weapons have come into the infantry that started coming in. The Lewis gun, the rifle grenade that came in 15, 16 are now the tactics used with those weapons are now being sort of perfected and solidified by 1918. And it's the 100 days, right? And it starts with Amiens, there's a break, and then they just go into a constant series of punches at the Germans, and they do not stop until the Germans essentially say, we can't do this anymore.
Right.
And that ends the war in November. So I know we've deviated from the whole crisis piece, but in coming to that crisis in 1918 in spring, the Germans put all their cards on the table. They put all their cards out. and their best ones, all their aces and kings and queens, they're all laid out on the table, and they pushed them all across, all the chips, all of them. And in the end, they couldn't buy victory, right? Somebody threw down a hand of cards at the after that was all done. It's like, well, nice try. You know, you almost had me, but guess what? You don't. And they begin to fight them back. The Black Day of the German Army is it's August 8th, is what Ludendorff calls it.
On August 8th, the Allies said, draw four. Uno rule.
Right. So it and then it's just a series of actions after that that just keep coming. There's more famous in the Canadian context. Cambrai, and I'm in no particular order here, Valenciennes, and of course, most perhaps notably is the capture of Mons, right, on the 11th of November. And ground beyond which, but the town itself, and there's a huge controversy in Canada, mostly driven politically because certain individuals didn't like Currie, and they were trying to use that as grounds to discredit him. So they fabricated this idea that he was needlessly sacrificing lives in a war that was essentially won, in pushing to take Mons at the very end of the war, at the end of it. He knew it was coming, but you still pushed on that last day. And so, you know what, it is debatable, I would consider, is that they were fighting until the last day. The Germans were fighting until the last day, like literally to the last minute. The last Canadian to die was the last person of the war in the context of the BEF to died at 11 o'clock, shot by a German sniper.
Well,
so they were fighting until the last second.
Well, we're Americans. Right? We know all about spending lives on November 11th right up to the very end. That's quite an American legacy of the First World War, was commanders that didn't have a lot of military battlefield, you could say, live experience. So there was a lot of blooding taking place, when the American forces right up till the end there. Classic pushing through to the end.
Right.
In fact, the last American troop killed during the First World War is buried not too far, about an hour's drive east of us in Maryland here, out in Baltimore.
Yep.
So we are very close to the American Expeditionary Force last casualty taken of the war. So speaking of pushing through to the end, Matt, we have slogged through the mud of the Western Front a couple different times now in the last two seasons. I am worn out intellectually. I cannot imagine what a single person that fought on the Somme, going back to season 2 with Verdun Regiment. I can't imagine what anybody that takes place in the First World War experienced at any given time. We spoke a lot, just a caveat to make sure that people understood that we were never demeaning or speaking lightly about the things that, if we were using a colloquialism or something like that, to describe waves or whatever, grinding down, getting a bloody nose. I think it's important to understand that it's almost impossible to talk about the First World War, most wars, but specifically the First World War, in terms that people truly understand. The numbers are astronomical. The blood is astronomical. People don't get it. So one, I will apologize for using terms like bloody nose, waves, things like that, but I will also not, because you need to understand in relative context what we're trying to discuss. You need to connect with it, and those are things you'll connect with. And the reason I won't apologize completely is because I think it's understood that at all times when we are speaking about war, we're talking about the last moments, the ends of lives. And it's not just the people that physically die or even live on a battlefield, but it's everything connected to that. Husbands, wives, children, parents, brothers, sisters, friends, communities, everything. You can never talk about this and take it lightly, even if you're saying something as simple as the unit pushed out and they got a bloody nose. Like, yes, we need to say things like that so you can understand the conversation, the lesson we're having, but never forget ever that, sure, 9 million, 10 million in the greater context of everything, like 20 million, whatever. Like, yes, those are lives lost, but every single one of those lives affected countless other lives.
Right.
It's so mind-numbingly large. So I hope you understand that at all times, Matt and I specifically are aware of that reverence. We know Rob, our esteemed guest today, is aware and keeps that reverence. So try to keep that reverence for yourself at any point in time when you're studying the great and terrible things. And I use great relatively, the great and terrible things that happen in warfare. So pushing through to the end here, Matt, let's wrap things up here in 1916 on the Somme and quarter 3.
Right. Rob, we just want to thank you for coming on and joining us yet again and giving us another just huge amount of information regarding this campaign, the Somme, and of course the Canadian forces there involved. We do want to encourage our listeners to check out Rob at British Muzzleloaders on YouTube. It's an awesome channel. It really is. He covers a lot of material, a lot of tech, war tech, obviously, and has some great demonstrations on there. So we definitely encourage you to check that out.
Follow us on our social media too. If you're going on YouTube, subscribe to British Muzzleloaders. Also subscribe to the History Things podcast. We have a YouTube channel that we launched earlier this year. We put a lot more stock into it. By the time this is airing in August, there's a whole lot of crazy, cool stuff you can find on there. So make sure you follow us on YouTube by searching the History Things podcast. You can search for us on Instagram and Facebook as well by searching for the History Things podcast. If you want to hang out with Matt and myself on our little solo endeavors, which there's not too many of those anymore. Matt's got a lot more of those than I do lately. Follow Matt at Matt Borders Books on Instagram only, because Matt just does not believe in Facebook, so you will never find him there. If you're following Matt Borders' Facebook page right now, you're getting scammed. Change your passwords, check your bank accounts, because Matty B doesn't have one. I do, though, because I'm a weirdo and I can't get off of it. So you can follow me at History Things with Pat on Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube as well. I have a YouTube channel. Don't do too much with it, but you can find it there. If you want to get in touch with the show, questions, comments, compliments, hopefully no concerns, but I guess we're big enough now that we should throw that out there, that if you have some concerns, you can reach out to us. Let us know politely. Don't be a dick. Don't attack us. You know the rules. We are always open to being corrected and learning, but we just don't like it when you come hot. So don't come hot. But send us an email, please, at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. If you're looking for ways to help the show, if you're enjoying what we're doing, I always like to close it out on this note. If you're enjoying the weird, because we started this show with being weird, right? I said Rob talks to himself. He was like, no, we got to caveat that. Like, of course, we're weird too. If you're enjoying the weird thing we're doing here on the History Things podcast, we encourage you to go to your favorite podcast app. Leave us a 5-star rating. Leave us a sweet review. Talk about how Matt is the best, most good-looking podcast host you've ever seen and heard in your entire lives. Please do it. In reality, that stuff helps us out and just helps us reach a bigger audience, which is all we're trying to do. This is a free show. It's a free download. We just want to make sure that we are spreading the info, spreading the signal. We're both big nerds, big Firefly guys. We're big believers in you can't stop the signal. So we're just trying to help it get out there, amplify it a little more. So for the History Things podcast, sponsored by TR Historical, our guest today has been Rob Enfield, host, proprietor, master of British Muzzleloaders. For my co-host, Matt Borders, I'm your co-host, Pat McGuire, saying this has been the History Things podcast. We will catch you all later.
Have a good night.
On Facebook and Instagram at the History Things Podcast for all the latest news and exclusives. Make sure to also follow Pat and Matt on their social medias at History Things with Pat and at Matt Borders Books. Have a question, comment, or compliment for the show? Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.